The story begins in a quiet coastal town called Kuruzu-cho. At first glance, it looks like the perfect place to live. Small houses stretch across the valley, a lonely lighthouse watches over the sea, and mountains surround the town from every direction. But if you look a little closer, you'll notice something strange. Spirals are everywhere. The clouds twist into endless circles, the plants curl unnaturally, and even the landscape itself seems to be trapped inside an invisible spiral. This is the town where Kiri Gashima grew up, and today she's about to tell us the terrifying story of the strange events that destroyed her hometown forever. Kiri is an ordinary high school student attending Kuruzu High School, located halfway up the mountain overlooking the town. She lives with her father, a local potter, her mother, and her younger brother. Her life is completely normal, or at least that's what she believes. Running down the hill toward the train station, Kiri worries she'll be late meeting her boyfriend, Shuichi Saito, who now attends a high school in the neighboring town. Everything feels like another ordinary morning. Until suddenly, a powerful whirlwind forms right in front of her. The spinning wind roars across the road, forcing Kiri to shield herself as leaves and dust swirl around her. She watches the tiny tornado in confusion. A whirlwind. Just as quickly as it appeared, it disappears, leaving the road completely silent. Kiri shrugs it off as a strange natural phenomenon and continues toward town, completely unaware that this is only the first warning. As she walks through a narrow alley, something catches her attention. Someone is crouching beside a stone wall. Looking closer, she realizes it's Shuichi's father. The old man doesn't seem to notice her at all. Instead, he's staring at something on the wall with complete concentration. Kiri politely greets him. "Hello, sir." No response. He remains frozen in place, completely absorbed by whatever he's looking at. Curious, Kiri steps closer. At first, she wonders if maybe he's watching an insect. But then, she finally sees it. A tiny snail shell. Nothing more than an ordinary spiral-shaped shell attached to the wall. The old man's eyes are locked onto it as if he's discovered the greatest treasure in the world. Kiri feels an uneasy chill. That's weird. Without another word, she quietly leaves. But deep inside, she can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong with Shuichi's father. A little later, Kiri finally arrives at Kuruzu Station. She sits alone on a bench as trains come and go, waiting patiently. Moments later, the train doors slide open. Stepping onto the platform is Shuichi Saito. The moment he notices Kiri, he walks toward her. Neither of them knows it yet. But this ordinary meeting is about to uncover a horrifying truth. Because Shuichi has already noticed something that everyone else in the town refuses to see. And once he reveals it, there will be no escaping the spiral. As they walked home together, Kiri casually mentioned what she had seen earlier that day. She told Shuichi that she thought she'd spotted his father in a dark alley, completely mesmerized by an empty snail shell. At first, she wasn't even sure it was really him. The alley had been dark and the whole situation felt so bizarre that she started doubting her own eyes. Shuichi let out a quiet sigh. Yes, that was probably my dad. There wasn't even a hint of surprise in his voice. Instead, he admitted that his father had been acting strangely for quite some time. That answer immediately caught Kiri off guard. What do you mean, strange? But Shuichi didn't answer right away. The two eventually reached a quiet neighborhood park and sat across from each other on a pair of swings. Kiri could tell something was weighing heavily on his mind. He looked exhausted, almost frightened. Trying to comfort him, she asked if something was bothering him. After several moments of silence, Shuichi finally spoke. Kiri, let's leave this town together. The words stunned her. Leave, you mean run away? Shuichi nodded without hesitation. I'm serious. I want to get out of here. Kiri couldn't understand why he was suddenly saying something so extreme. After all, Kuruzu-cho had always been their home. But Shuichi's expression only grew darker. I can't stand this place anymore. If we stay here, we'll go crazy. Kiri frowned in confusion. She didn't feel anything unusual. To her, everything seemed perfectly normal. But Shuichi insisted she simply couldn't see what he saw. Every single day, whenever he returned from school in the neighboring town, the moment he stepped off the station platform, a strange dizziness overwhelmed him. It was as if the town itself was pulling him in. The farther away I am, the more obvious it becomes. This town is driving me insane. Just then, the loud town siren echoed across the streets. The sharp sound made Shuichi suddenly grab both sides of his head. I hate that sound. It pierces straight through my ears. Kiri watched in complete disbelief. To her, it was nothing more than the ordinary evening siren. But to Shuichi, it sounded unbearable. As they continued walking through town, Shuichi pointed toward the gloomy coastline stretching beneath the cloudy sky. I hate that sea. Then he looked toward the towering mountains surrounding the town. And those mountains. His eyes slowly moved across the twisting streets, the tightly packed houses, and finally toward the sky itself. Everything seemed to curl into endless spirals. The ocean. The mountains. The winding roads. They're all the same. He whispered something so quietly that Kiri almost missed it. This town is contaminated by spirals. For a brief second, his eyes widened with genuine fear. I'm getting wound up. But almost immediately, he stopped himself. When Kiri asked what he had just said, he simply shook his head. Nothing. Yet the uneasy look on his face refused to disappear. The very next day, Shuichi's father paid a visit to Kiri's father's pottery workshop. At first, everything seemed like a friendly conversation. He praised Kiri's father for his craftsmanship and complimented the beautiful traditional ceramics he created every day. But little by little, the conversation took a disturbing turn. He suddenly smiled and declared that pottery wasn't beautiful because of the clay. It was beautiful because of the spiral. The spinning wheel. The art of the spiral. It can make you dizzy. His eyes sparkled with an unsettling excitement. Then he made a very unusual request. I want a bowl. But not just any bowl. I want one with a perfect spiral pattern. The spiral, he claimed, was the most important part. Unable to contain his excitement, the old man began listing every spiral he had become obsessed with. Snail shells. Conch shells. Ammonite fossils. Coiled springs. Mosquito coils. Twisting vines. Even old kimono patterns. They're everywhere once you start looking. Lately, I've come to love that shape. I'm collecting everything that has spirals. The room fell completely silent. Even Kiri and her younger brother, listening nearby, couldn't hide their discomfort. Then the old man leaned closer to Kiri's father with eyes burning with obsession. Money doesn't matter. Name your price. I want this town's greatest potter to create the perfect spiral bowl. He spoke about spirals as though they were sacred. They're mystical. No other shape in nature fascinates me like this. The spiral is perfect. The most sublime art in existence. His face twisted into an unnaturally wide smile as he stared directly into Kiri's father. The cheerful customer who had entered the workshop just moments ago now looked like someone completely consumed by madness. Later, Kiri brought up the strange visit while talking with Shuichi. She admitted that his father's behavior had frightened her. Shuichi simply apologized. He wasn't always like this. But lately, his obsession has become abnormal. According to Shuichi, his father had practically abandoned his normal life. He no longer worked. Instead, he locked himself inside his study every single day, surrounded by one thing: spirals. And when Kiri finally saw what had filled that room, she realized this nightmare had only just begun. As Shuichi continued explaining his father's obsession, his voice became even more uneasy. He said that once his father became fixated on a spiral, nothing else existed. No matter how loudly they called his name, he couldn't hear a single word. He would simply sit there, staring endlessly into the spiral as if the rest of the world had disappeared. But that wasn't even the strangest part. Shuichi took a deep breath before revealing something almost impossible to believe. His eyes. They start spinning. They actually rotate around and around, following the spiral. Kiri blinked in disbelief. What? His eyes spin. She couldn't help but laugh nervously. Maybe Shuichi was exaggerating. Maybe his father was just playing some bizarre joke. But Shuichi immediately shook his head. I'm not joking. His right and left eyes move independently of each other. His face showed genuine fear. He wasn't telling a ghost story. He was describing something he had actually witnessed. Then Shuichi told her what happened during dinner the previous night. Everything had seemed perfectly normal. Until his father suddenly exploded with anger. There were no spiral-shaped fish cakes in the miso soup. That tiny detail was enough to send him into a fit of rage. His mother calmly explained they had simply run out. But instead of calming down, his father grabbed his chopsticks and began stirring the soup faster and faster. The entire bowl turned into a spinning whirlpool. Only after creating that perfect spiral did he finally smile with satisfaction. And the obsession didn't stop there. Before taking a bath, his father always stirred the water with a bucket until a massive whirlpool formed in the tub. Only then would he slowly lower himself into the spinning water, watching it swirl around his body as if he were hypnotized. Kiri couldn't help letting out a nervous laugh. It all sounded too ridiculous to be real. But Shuichi wasn't offended. Instead, he looked down sadly. I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe it either. Then he made her an offer. If you come with me, you'll understand. You might end up hating this town just as much as I do. The two continued walking through the quiet streets. As they passed a narrow canal, Shuichi suddenly stopped. He pointed toward the flowing water. Do you notice anything strange? Kiri leaned closer. The stream was filled with tiny whirlpools. One after another. Dozens of them. She casually assumed they were just created by the current. But Shuichi wasn't convinced. Then he pointed toward small dust devils dancing across the road. And finally, toward miniature whirlwinds spinning through the air. Everywhere he looked, nature itself seemed obsessed with spirals. To Kiri, they were ordinary phenomena. To Shuichi, they were warning signs. Before he could explain any further, a horrifying scream suddenly echoed through the neighborhood. How could you? The scream came from Shuichi's house. Without thinking, both of them sprinted inside. What they found froze them in place. Shuichi's father had completely lost control. He was violently attacking his own wife. His mother struggled desperately while trying to explain herself. I threw away your collection. You have to wake up. You need to go back to work. Those words only made him even more furious. His face twisted with madness as he screamed. She threw away my collection. Shuichi rushed forward and pulled him away before things became even worse. Breathing heavily, his father suddenly became calm. Then he smiled. So it's gone. I don't care. Confused, everyone stared at him. Then he looked directly at Shuichi with a terrifying grin. I don't need to collect spirals anymore. I finally realized. You can create spirals yourself. For a brief second, nobody understood what he meant. Then, he grabbed a chopstick, and without the slightest hesitation, he shoved it straight into his own eye. The room fell completely silent. Kiri watched in absolute horror as the chopstick dug deep into his eyeball. Instead of screaming, he laughed. Slowly, his eye began twisting inside its socket. The pupil rotated. The veins stretched unnaturally. The entire eyeball spun around like it was no longer human. Then, the second eye started moving as well. Each eye rotated independently, spinning in opposite directions, exactly the way Shuichi had described. Kiri stood frozen. She had laughed only moments ago. But now, she was seeing the impossible with her own eyes. Shuichi hadn't been imagining things. Everything he had said was true. Several days passed after that horrifying incident. Neither Shuichi nor Kiri spoke about his father again. It was as though both of them were desperately trying to erase that nightmare from their memories. Life slowly appeared to return to normal. One afternoon, Kiri's father asked her to deliver a finished pottery piece to a customer. It seemed like an ordinary errand. A peaceful walk through town. But after witnessing what had happened inside Shuichi's house, even the quiet streets of Kuruzucho no longer felt safe. And neither of them realized that the spiral's curse had only just begun. Kiri had barely recovered from the horror of Shuichi's father's spinning eyes when the old man appeared before her once again. But this time, he smiled calmly. "I told you before. I don't need to collect spirals anymore. You can create them from inside yourself." Before Kiri could even react, he stuck out his tongue. At first it looked completely normal. Then, the impossible happened. His tongue slowly began twisting. It curled tighter and tighter until it transformed into a perfect spiral. Drool dripped from the grotesque shape as the old man proudly showed it off like a priceless work of art. "Look what I can do now." Kiri's entire body froze. The sight was so unnatural that her mind refused to process it. Then fear finally caught up with her. She let out a blood-curdling scream, dropped the package, and ran as fast as she could. The delivery man arriving at the house stared in complete confusion, having no idea what nightmare had just unfolded. A few days later, the town was holding a funeral. Shuichi's father, Mr. Saito, was dead. To everyone else, it was just another tragic accident. But Shuichi knew the truth. Standing beside the funeral hall, he quietly turned toward Kiri. "Do you want to know how my father really died?" His voice was completely emotionless. Everyone believed he had simply fallen down the stairs. That was the official story. But it was a lie. Shuichi explained what had really happened. After his father's behavior became increasingly disturbing, his mother finally decided they needed professional help. Together they consulted a doctor. The three of them agreed that Mr. Saito needed to be hospitalized. But when they returned home that night, he was gone. They searched every room, every hallway, every corner of the house. There wasn't a trace of him. Until they entered his study. In the middle of the room, they discovered a gigantic wooden tub. None of them had ever seen it before. It hadn't been there earlier. Confused, Shuichi and his mother slowly lifted the heavy lid. Neither of them was prepared for what waited inside. Curled tightly into the shape of a perfect spiral was Mr. Saito. His entire body had somehow folded inward. Bones, muscles, limbs, everything had twisted together into one horrifying spiral. It looked less like a human body, and more like a giant snail trapped inside its own shell. Shuichi could barely force the words out. "I don't know how, but somehow." He climbed inside that tub and turned himself into a spiral. The pressure crushed his own body. That's how he died. Even after death, the spiral had claimed him completely. Silence filled the cemetery. Neither Kiri nor Shuichi could find the words to respond. Then, someone suddenly shouted, "Look! Up in the sky!" The entire crowd turned toward the smoke rising from the crematorium chimney. At first, it looked perfectly ordinary. But as the smoke climbed higher, it slowly began to twist. Round and round. Higher and higher. Forming one enormous spiral across the sky. Everyone stood frozen. Some stared in confusion. Others couldn't look away. And deep inside, Shuichi realized something terrifying. The curse hadn't ended with his father's death. If anything, it had only become stronger. And what emerged from that spiral next would push the town far beyond the point of no return. The entire crowd stood frozen as the smoke from the crematorium climbed into the sky. Instead of fading away, it kept twisting, round and round, growing into an enormous spiral that swallowed the clouds above the town. An old man whispered in fear, "This must be a bad omen." Even Kiri couldn't take her eyes off it. Then the impossible happened. The black smoke suddenly broke away from the giant spiral and began drifting across the town like it had a destination. Everyone watched in complete silence. "It's heading toward Dragonfly Pond." Someone shouted. Dragonfly Pond. The pond located right in the center of town. And even more disturbing, it was directly behind Shuichi's house. Nobody understood what they were witnessing. But every instinct told them something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, Shuichi's mother completely lost control. She grabbed both sides of her head and screamed at the sky. Go away. Please stop it. She wasn't talking to the crowd. She was talking to the smoke itself. The mourners rushed toward her, trying to calm her down. But she kept screaming in absolute terror. Shuichi held her shoulders. Mom, calm down. Then she pointed into the sky with trembling hands. That's your father. Shuichi immediately denied it. No, this is just a coincidence. But before anyone could argue, the drifting smoke began changing shape. The swirling clouds slowly formed a human face. For only a brief second, everyone could clearly see it. It was the face of Shuichi's father. His hollow eyes. His twisted expression. Staring down from the sky itself. Shuichi's mother let out an uncontrollable scream. Then, she suddenly burst into hysterical laughter. Laughing. Crying. Screaming. All at the same time. The funeral instantly descended into complete chaos. Someone yelled, "Call an ambulance!" As the eerie smoke continued floating toward Dragonfly Pond. Shuichi's mother was rushed to Kurazu Hospital. After that day, nothing was ever the same. Inside the hospital, she became terrified of every spiral she saw. Even the simplest things became unbearable. The curl of someone's hair. The swirl of a nurse's bun. Even the tiny spiral pattern inside her own eyes. Every spiral looked exactly like her husband's twisted body. Whenever she saw one, she screamed in panic. Doctors tried everything. But her fear only became worse. Eventually, she shaved her head completely. She couldn't bear seeing even a single strand of hair curl. Soon, she stopped eating solid food because she feared anything shaped like a spiral. Then her paranoia reached an even darker level. She stared at her own fingertips. The natural whorls in her fingerprints looked like tiny spirals. To her, they were alive. In desperation, she grabbed a pair of scissors and began cutting the skin from her own fingers and toes, trying to erase every last spiral from her body. Watching all of this unfold, Shuichi spoke quietly to Kiri. My mother is completely consumed by the curse. To her, every spiral looks exactly like my father's body. According to Shuichi, she even claimed his father still visited her. She insisted he stood beside her bed, looking directly at her, whispering only one sentence. Come, join me in the spiral. The doctors believed she had completely lost touch with reality. Even the nurses became careful not to expose her to spiral patterns. Shuichi himself started wearing gloves and a cap, just so she wouldn't notice the spiral patterns in his fingerprints, or the natural whorls in his hair. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't simply madness. The spiral curse wasn't over. It was spreading. Slowly. Silently. And the next victim had already been chosen. After weeks of living in constant fear, Shuichi's mother finally seemed a little calmer. She had shaved off every strand of hair, covered every part of her body that reminded her of spirals. And for the first time, she could speak without screaming. Hoping she was recovering, Shuichi brought her to meet the hospital director. The elderly doctor smiled kindly. So, how are you feeling today? She answered quietly. Pretty good. The doctor nodded before asking the question everyone feared. Are you still afraid of spirals? After a long pause, she whispered. Yes. I still am. The room fell silent. The doctor sighed and gently suggested transferring her to a psychiatric hospital where she could receive specialized treatment. There is nothing to be ashamed of, he explained. We simply want to help. To reassure her, he pointed toward an anatomical chart hanging on the wall. He explained that the inner ear contains the cochlea, a tiny spiral-shaped organ responsible for hearing. There is absolutely nothing to fear. But the moment Shuichi looked at the chart, his entire body froze. A spiral, hidden inside every human ear. His eyes widened in horror. The doctor noticed his reaction. What's wrong? Shuichi immediately forced a smile. It's nothing. But inside, a terrifying realization had already begun to grow. Later, Shuichi spoke honestly with his mother. He gently told her that going to the psychiatric hospital might be the best choice. At first, she refused. That's where your father was supposed to go. I don't want to go there. But after a long silence, she lowered her head. I won't hurt myself anymore. I already removed every spiral from my body. Shuichi wanted to believe her. Then, the town's 5 o'clock siren echoed across the mountains. The loud sound made her instantly cover her ears. I hate that noise. It pierces through my ears. Those words stopped Shuichi in his tracks. As he and Kiri walked home, his face turned pale. My mother doesn't realize it yet. I thought hair and fingerprints were the only spirals on the human body. But there is another one. He pointed toward his ear. The cochlea. The spiral-shaped organ inside every person's inner ear. Kiri covered her mouth in shock. If she discovers that, what will she do? Neither of them wanted to know the answer. That night, the hospital became strangely quiet. Mrs. Sato slept peacefully in her room. Outside, only the faint footsteps of the night staff echoed through the hallway. Then, something tiny crawled across her pillow. A centipede. It slowly crept toward her ear. Without waking her, it slipped inside. For a moment, everything was silent. Then her eyes suddenly opened. She could hear something moving. Deep inside her head, the centipede crawled farther into her ear canal. Terrified, she screamed and threw herself out of bed. But the creature wasn't alone. More centipedes appeared. Dozens of them, curling together into grotesque spirals across the floor. Their bodies twisted tighter and tighter, until they formed a living spiral that looked almost alive with evil. Mrs. Sato stared in absolute horror. Then, the nightmare became even worse. From inside the mass of writhing centipedes, a familiar face slowly emerged. It was her dead husband. His rotten face twisted unnaturally as he smiled. Yoki, come, join me in the spiral. She backed away trembling. No. The horrifying figure continued speaking. Why do you hate spirals so much? You still have them inside your body. I want to crawl into your ears. I want to curl up deep inside them. His voice echoed through the room like a curse. Mrs. Sato let out a blood-curdling scream. And in that terrifying moment, the spiral claimed another victim. The next morning, Shuichi and Kiri rushed to the hospital after hearing that his mother had screamed throughout the night. She looked strangely calm. Almost too calm. When the nurse came to check her temperature, Mrs. Sato suddenly looked at her and asked an innocent question. I was wondering, what's inside the human ear? The room instantly fell silent. Shuichi's face turned pale. The nurse smiled, not realizing the danger. What do you mean? Mrs. Sato slowly whispered. Don't tell me. There's a spiral inside it. The nurse laughed nervously. Of course not. But that answer wasn't enough. Mrs. Sato sat upright. Really? I want to see the anatomical chart in the director's office. Before anyone could stop her, she jumped out of bed and sprinted into the hallway. Her injured leg didn't matter anymore. She had only one goal: to discover the truth. Shuichi chased after her while Kiri followed close behind. She burst into the director's office without hesitation. Doctor, show me your anatomical charts. The old doctor was completely stunned. She grabbed him by the collar. Tell me, is there a spiral inside the human ear? Confused, the director answered. I threw that old chart away. It was outdated. But she refused to believe him. You're lying. There has to be another chart. Without waiting, she ripped open cabinets, pulled books off the shelves, and desperately searched every medical reference she could find. Shuichi begged her to stop, but she couldn't hear him anymore. Then, she suddenly froze. Her face became deathly pale. Last night, she remembered hearing her dead husband whisper something. About my ears. Shuichi shouted back. Dad is dead. You were dreaming. Those words finally snapped her back to reality. The director quietly pulled Shuichi aside. I'm glad I removed that chart. We need to transfer her to a specialist immediately. Otherwise, her condition would only get worse. That evening, the nurses prepared Mrs. Sato for her transfer the next day. "This is your last night here. Get some rest." She thanked them politely. Everything seemed peaceful again. Until she looked at the IV bottle hanging above her bed. At first, it was only a tiny swirl in the liquid. Then, the entire bag slowly twisted into a giant spiral. The liquid inside began spinning faster and faster, until terrifying faces appeared inside the vortex, whispering, "There are spirals in your ears." Mrs. Sato covered her ears in terror. "No, no." The voices only grew louder. "There are spirals in your ears. He's inside them. I can still hear him." Driven completely insane, she ripped the IV from her arm. Glass exploded across the room. The metal stand crashed onto the floor. Blood dripped from the needle as she screamed uncontrollably. "He slipped into the spirals in my ears. I can still hear him." Panicking, she grabbed a pair of surgical scissors. With trembling hands, she slowly raised the sharp blade toward her own ear. "I'll get them out." The scissors touched her skin, and before anyone could stop her, she prepared to cut into her own ear, believing it was the only way to escape the spiral's curse. But it was already too late. Driven completely insane by the whispers inside her head, Mrs. Sato plunged the scissors into both of her ears. The doctors managed to stop her before she could kill herself. But the damage was irreversible. She had destroyed not only her hearing, but also the delicate organs responsible for her balance. From that day forward, the world never stopped spinning. Every second felt like she was trapped inside an endless vortex. She screamed in agony. "My body. It's becoming a spiral. I don't want to become a spiral." No matter how hard the doctors tried, nothing could free her from the curse. The spiral never left her. It haunted her every waking moment, until the day she finally died. Even death wasn't the end. On the day of her funeral, as flames consumed her body, everyone expected the nightmare to end. Instead, something far more horrifying happened. The smoke rising from the cremation furnace didn't drift away like ordinary smoke. It slowly twisted, round and round, until it formed a gigantic black spiral in the sky. The entire town watched in silent terror. Because this wasn't just smoke. It was another sign that the spiral curse was growing stronger. And as Shuichi stared into that impossible vortex, he realized the horrifying truth. His mother's death hadn't ended the curse. It had only fed it. And whatever was controlling the spirals was far from finished. Time passed, and after everything that had happened, life slowly returned to something that looked normal. When Kiri started attending Midoriyama High School, she met a beautiful transfer student named Azami Kurotani. At first, Azami seemed like the perfect girl. She was quiet, elegant, and almost unnaturally beautiful, but looking back now, Kiri wished she had never become friends with her, because if they had never met, Azami would have never crossed paths with Shuichi, and maybe everything that followed could have been avoided. From her very first day at school, Azami attracted attention wherever she went. Every hallway she walked through, every classroom she entered, boys gathered around her without even realizing it. Confessions came one after another. Motorcyclists stopped beside her to ask for a ride. Strangers shouted compliments as she passed by. But Azami never reacted. She ignored every single one of them with an emotionless face, as if she had experienced this her entire life. Soon the whispers began. Students claimed she had some kind of mysterious power over men. Some said every boy who fell for her became completely obsessed. Others warned Kiri to stay away, saying Azami would eventually steal her boyfriend too. The rumors became stranger with each passing day. People claimed the secret was hidden beneath her bangs. They said there was a scar on her forehead, and that scar was somehow the source of her supernatural charm. Kiri wanted to dismiss the gossip as childish nonsense, but curiosity quietly lingered in the back of her mind. Later that day, after gym class, Azami splashed water across her face before turning toward Kiri with a gentle smile. Without hesitation, she brushed her bangs aside, revealing a pale, crescent-shaped scar on her forehead. "So, this is what they were talking about." Kiri stared at it in silence. Azami simply smiled. She explained that she got the scar as a little girl after falling from the playground ropes while trying to impress a boy she liked. Ironically, that accident was how the two girls who rescued her first became her friends. Then Azami admitted something even stranger. Ever since receiving that scar, every boy she had ever fallen for had somehow fallen in love with her instead. She laughed it off as nothing more than coincidence. but there was something unsettling in the way she said it. As if even she wasn't completely convinced, the next day, as the two girls walked home together, Azami suddenly changed the subject. "So, this boyfriend of yours, I meet him." Kiri immediately hesitated. She explained that Shuichi hadn't been coming to school lately after losing both of his parents. He had gone through more pain than anyone should ever endure. She didn't think introducing him to someone new was a good idea, but Azami kept insisting. Eventually, Kiri gave in. Short while later, the two girls arrived at Shuichi's house. Kiri knocked on the door moments later. Shuichi quietly opened it. His tired eyes slowly moved toward the unfamiliar girl standing beside Kiri. Kiri smiled nervously. "Shuichi, this is my classmate, Azami Kurotani." Azami stepped forward with a calm, confident smile. "Hello, you can call me Azami." Neither of them realized it yet, but this simple introduction was about to pull Shuichi into another nightmare, and this time. The spiral wasn't the only danger waiting for him. The moment Shuichi looked into Azami's eyes, his entire body froze. It felt as if he wasn't looking at a person anymore, but into the center of a living spiral. His breathing became frantic, his hands trembled uncontrollably. Then, without warning, he staggered backward in pure terror. "Go away," his voice echoed through the house. "Don't ever come back." Kiri was completely stunned. She had never seen Shuichi react like this before. Azami didn't say a word. She simply stood there staring at him with wide, confused eyes. Eventually the two girls left. Kiri apologized over and over, explaining that Shuichi had been acting strangely ever since the spiral curse began. Azami quietly accepted the apology, but during the entire walk home, she barely spoke. Something inside her had clearly changed. Later that night, Kiri called Shuichi. She wanted to understand why he had treated Azami so harshly. After a long silence, Shuichi finally spoke. There was something about her. It felt exactly like staring into a spiral. The same dizziness, the same vertigo. The moment I looked at her, I knew. She's contaminated. She's becoming part of the spiral. Kiri couldn't believe what she was hearing. Azami wasn't cursed, was she? Before Shuichi could explain further, the doorbell suddenly rang. Late at night, he cautiously walked toward the entrance. The moment he slid the door open, his heart nearly stopped. Standing outside, perfectly still, was Azami. That strange hypnotic aura surrounded her once again. Shuichi stumbled backward in horror. "What are you doing here?" But Azami calmly stepped inside. For the first time, the mask of calmness disappeared from her face. She looked directly at Shuichi and asked, "What is it about me that you hate? Every boy I've ever met has fallen in love with me. So why did you reject me?" Shuichi desperately ordered her to leave, but Azami refused. Then Shuichi finally shouted the truth. "Hiding something on your forehead? That isn't a scar anymore. It's a spiral." Confused, Azami slowly brushed her bangs aside. At first, she expected to reveal the same crescent-shaped scar she'd had since childhood. Instead, she froze right in the center of her forehead. The scar had transformed. The crescent was gone. A perfect spiral now stared back at her. Shuichi screamed, "I knew it! The town is changing you. The spiral is growing. Leave Kurazucho immediately. Go back to Midoriyama before it's too late." For a brief moment, fear appeared in Azami's eyes. She touched the strange mark again and again, unable to believe it was real. But instead of leaving town, she made the worst decision possible, completely ignoring Shuichi's warning. Azami convinced her parents to rent an apartment in Kurazucho. From that day on, she couldn't stop thinking about Shuichi. Not because of his kindness, but because he was the only boy who had ever rejected her. Every night, she went to his house. She pounded on his door, begging him to come outside, crying that she had never felt this way before. Meanwhile, Kiri tried to stop her. "Azami, please don't visit Shuichi anymore. Doesn't want this. He's my boyfriend." But Azami refused to listen. "If he doesn't love me, make him." Obsession inside her grew stronger every day. Then, without warning, a violent gust of wind exploded between the two girls. The air twisted into a spinning vortex. Azami instinctively grabbed her forehead. Kiri looked up, and her blood ran cold. The mark was growing. The tiny spiral had expanded into a massive, horrifying whirlpool embedded directly into Azami's forehead. It no longer looked like a scar. It looked like the curse itself had claimed her body. Panicked, Azami turned and ran, completely unaware that the spiral had only just begun feeding on her. Azami tried to run. She wanted to escape from the unbearable pain spreading through her forehead, but no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the spiral growing inside her. As Kiri desperately called out her name, someone else suddenly appeared at Azami's apartment, a boy from school, Okada. Standing nervously at her door, he confessed, "Please, go out with me." Azami immediately rejected him. "I already told you no, leave me alone." But something was terribly wrong. Instead of walking away, Okada stood there with a blank expression. "No, you rejected me. I can't stay away from you. It's like I'm being pulled toward you." His voice sounded empty, almost hypnotized. Meanwhile, Azami stopped coming to school. Growing worried, Kiri visited her apartment. She knocked again and again, but nobody answered. Even so, she had the strange feeling that Azami was still inside. Kiri couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. That horrifying spiral looked as though it was drilling deeper into Azami's skull every single day. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe fear was making her hallucinate. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. Several days later, the phone rang. It was Shuichi. He asked a strange question. "Kiri, do you know someone named Okada?" Apparently, the boy had called Shuichi out of nowhere. He claimed he wanted to talk about Kiri, and asked Shuichi to meet him at the park. Neither of them understood what was happening. Still, Shuichi agreed to go. The moment Kiri hung up, an uneasy feeling settled over her. Something about this didn't feel right. As night covered the town, She hurried toward the park alone. On the way, she noticed a girl wearing a white hat walking ahead for some reason. The girl's silhouette felt strangely familiar, then realization struck. Azami. She ran after her when the girl finally stopped. She slowly turned around, her movements were stiff, her right eye seemed unfocused. She quietly whispered, "Kiri, my right eye feels strange. You take a look." The moment Azami removed her hat, Kiri's entire body froze. The tiny spiral was gone now. Almost her entire forehead had transformed into an enormous spiral, each ring twisted deeper than the last. As if her skull itself had been carved into a living vortex, and inside that spiral, something moved. A pale, slimy, human eye slowly rotated through the grooves. The spiral wasn't just growing anymore, it was alive. Kiri stumbled backward in horror. At that exact moment, not far away, Shuichi met Okada at the park. Okada pointed toward the entrance. "She's coming." Shuichi looked up and saw Azami approaching through the darkness. Okada smiled nervously. "I brought Shuichi like you asked. You'll go out with me, right?" Azami's lips slowly curled into a smile. "I don't need you anymore. Only wanted to see Shuichi." Color instantly drained from Okada's face. "You promised." "I brought him, you liar." Consumed by rage, he raised his fist and punched Azami across the face. The impact echoed through the silent park, but instead of screaming, Azami laughed, a slow, disturbing, endless laugh. He. Her hair slipped away from her face. The spiral had swallowed almost everything. Her eye disappeared into the endless rings. Even her mouth seemed trapped beneath the twisting pattern. Okada stared in complete disbelief. "Happened to you?" Trembling, he reached out with shaking fingers. Is that bone?" The second his hand touched the spiral, the impossible happened. The spiral suddenly twisted forward like a living drill with a sickening tearing sound. It shot outward and slammed straight into Okada's face. His terrified scream echoed through the night. As the monstrous spiral consumed everything in its path, the moment Okada disappeared, Kiri screamed Shuichi's name, her voice echoing through the empty park, but there was no answer. Panic rushed through her as she searched the darkness. Then she spotted Shuichi high up in a tree. He had climbed there to stay as far away from Azami as possible. Breathing heavily, he shouted, "Okada just got sucked in. And now, she's going to disappear too." Kiri looked down in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Shuichi pointed toward Azami. "Look." The horrifying spiral covering her face was no longer standing still. It had spread beyond her forehead. The spiral was swallowing her entire body. Her neck twisted into a tightening coil. Her shoulders folded inward. Her arms, legs, and torso began wrapping around themselves as though her flesh had forgotten what it meant to be human. Every second, the spiral pulled her deeper into itself. Her body shrank, folded, compressed, until nothing remained except the endless rotating vortex. Then, with one final violent twist, she disappeared completely. Not a drop of blood, not a single bone, not even a strand of hair remained. Azami Kurotani had been devoured from head to toe, without leaving behind a single trace. The park fell completely silent. Kiri stood frozen. Shuichi stared in absolute disbelief. Neither of them could understand what they had just witnessed. One thing, however, was painfully clear. The curse of Kuruzucho wasn't simply driving people insane anymore. Now, it was erasing them from existence. And if the spiral could consume an entire person, who would be next? Days passed after Azami's horrifying disappearance, but instead of fading away, the curse only became more terrifying. When Kiri looked up at the sky, she froze. The smoke rising from the town crematorium no longer drifted naturally. Ever since Shuichi's father's funeral, every plume of smoke twisted into enormous spirals that spread across the entire sky. It looked as though the heavens themselves had been infected. Little Mitsuo pointed upward and said another cremation had just begun. Together, they watched the dark spiral descend slowly from the clouds. Instead of disappearing into the wind, it seemed to be pulled toward Dragonfly Pond. The smoke stretched lower and lower, as if an invisible force beneath the water was dragging it down. Kiri couldn't take her eyes off it. Whatever was hiding inside that pond, it wasn't just affecting people anymore. It was pulling the entire town into its curse. Meanwhile, the smoke pouring from Shuichi's family's kiln had begun twisting into spirals as well. Shuichi's mother called everyone inside, worried that staring at the strange phenomenon would only make things worse. But Shuichi's father wasn't paying attention to the sky. He had locked himself inside the kiln, desperately tending the fire throughout the night. His exhausted face was covered in sweat and his trembling eyes looked filled with fear. When his wife offered to help, he suddenly exploded with anger. "Stay back. Don't look inside the kiln." His reaction shocked everyone, whatever was burning inside. He clearly didn't want his own family to see it. Soon after, the family traveled to Midoriyama City's cultural center, where Shuichi's father was displaying his latest ceramic collection. At first glance, everyone expected ordinary pottery. Instead, the entire exhibition looked like something born from a nightmare. Every vase, every plate, every sculpture had melted into impossible shapes. Twisted spirals covered every surface. Organic-looking patterns spread across the clay like living flesh. The judges stared at the bizarre creations in complete silence. One of them finally admitted, "As practical pottery, these pieces failed. As works of art, they're extraordinary." The strange spiral patterns looked almost alive. When asked how he created them, Shuichi's father simply smiled. He claimed they had formed naturally inside the kiln because of a chemical reaction. But even the experienced experts had never seen clay behave like this before. Later, the family brought several of the bizarre ceramics home. As Kiri and Mitsuo looked more closely, something horrifying revealed itself. Hidden inside the countless spiral patterns were human faces. Distorted expressions of terror seemed trapped within the clay itself. One sculpture contained a screaming face, another revealed hollow eyes staring from inside the spirals. Then Kiri noticed something that made her blood run cold. One face looked exactly like Shuichi's father, another resembled his mother. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Even Shuichi's mother admitted they looked frighteningly familiar, but Shuichi's father refused to believe it. He insisted it was only a coincidence. Still, as Kiri stared into those twisted sculptures, she couldn't shake the feeling that the kiln wasn't creating pottery anymore. It was preserving something far more terrifying. And whatever was trapped inside those spirals might still be alive. The mystery surrounding the cursed pottery only grew darker. When Shuichi's father examined the strange sculptures again, everyone discovered something horrifying. There weren't just two familiar faces anymore, there were four. And the two new faces belonged to townspeople who had died only recently. Every single one of them had been cremated in Kuruzu-cho. It was as if their ashes and smoke had somehow fused into the clay itself. Shuichi's mother stared at the pottery in disbelief. Could you make something so terrible? But the old potter looked just as confused. He quietly admitted that he didn't fully understand it either. To him, ceramics were born from earth and fire. Humans merely shaped the clay. Nature did the rest. Sometimes nature created things beyond human imagination. His explanation sounded calm, but no one in the room felt reassured anymore. Meanwhile, Kiri noticed Shuichi hadn't been to school for days. He had stopped eating properly and was wasting away. Feeling sorry for him, Kiri's mother prepared a large homemade dinner and insisted on inviting him over. At first, Shuichi refused. He desperately tried to pull away. Don't want to go? Then he revealed the real reason. Kiri's house stood beside Dragonfly Pond. The pond is infected by spirals. The word sent a chill through the air. Even so, Kiri eventually convinced him to come, the moment he sat at the dinner table. Everyone noticed how hungry he was. He devoured bowl after bowl of rice and noodles as if he hadn't eaten in days. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal until Shuichi suddenly froze, his eyes locked onto the plate beneath his food. His face instantly turned pale. He staggered backward, nearly collapsing. His hands trembled violently. That plate, I get dizzy just looking at it. Kiri looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. The plate wasn't ordinary. It was one of the strange spiral plates Shuichi's father had created. The old potter couldn't understand the reaction. To him, it was his greatest masterpiece. He proudly explained that he had finally discovered the perfect clay. When Shuichi demanded to know where the clay came from, the answer made everyone's blood run cold. Dragonfly Pond. Silence filled the room. Shuichi immediately ran outside, covering his mouth in disgust. He warned everyone that the mud at the bottom of Dragonfly Pond could contain the remains of countless dead people. How could anyone eat from a plate made with that clay? But Kiri's mother still couldn't believe it. After all, to her it was just a plate. That very night, unable to stop worrying, Kiri secretly followed Shuichi's father, and what she witnessed left her speechless. Without a moment of hesitation, the old man walked straight into Dragonfly Pond carrying buckets. He scooped thick mud from the bottom, completely soaked from head to toe, then climbed back onto shore laughing like a child, soaking wet. His cheerful voice sounded completely wrong in the middle of the cursed night. From that day forward, he abandoned the twisted sculptures. He returned to making perfectly normal vases, but he quietly admitted something unsettling. The clay only transformed after it entered the kiln, not before. For 6 straight days and nights, the kiln burned without stopping. No one was allowed anywhere near it. Late one night, Kiri looked out her bedroom window. The fire was still roaring. Shuichi's father hadn't slept in 2 entire days. A terrible feeling settled in her chest. If he collapsed beside the blazing kiln, the entire cottage could catch fire. Unable to ignore her instincts any longer, Kiri stepped outside to check on him, but she had no idea. The nightmare waiting inside that cottage was far worse than a simple fire. The roaring kiln echoed through the silent night like a living monster. Unable to shake her uneasy feeling, Kiri quietly stepped inside the workshop. Her father was exactly where she expected him to be, fast asleep beside a pile of firewood. Relieved, she turned her attention toward the blazing kiln. Its deafening roar seemed almost unnatural. As she slowly approached, a strange feeling washed over her. Almost against her will, she leaned toward the tiny opening in the furnace. Then, she looked inside and instantly wished she hadn't. Behind the wall of flames was a nightmare beyond imagination. The entire kiln was packed with countless twisted human faces. Some screamed, some cried, some silently stared with hollow eyes. Their bodies had melted together into an endless mass of spirals, stretching through the fire like tortured souls trapped forever. The flames carried only one desperate cry. Heat. The heat. Shuichi, help me. Kiri's entire body froze. This can't be. Suddenly her father's voice snapped her back to reality. Kiri, what are you doing? I told you never to come near the kiln. Terrified, Kiri stumbled back toward the house, but the horrifying voices refused to leave her ears that night. Even after climbing into bed, the screams continued. She could still hear them. Heat, the heat, they're going to suffer for 4 more days. Their voices are reaching all the way here. No matter how tightly she covered her ears, the cries only became louder. Then, her phone suddenly rang. It was Shuichi. His voice sounded weak and distant. He claimed he had simply been lonely. But Kiri immediately noticed something was wrong. She could hear another voice behind him. Someone was screaming. When she confronted him, Shuichi kept denying it, but Kiri knew she wasn't imagining things. Then everything finally clicked. This wasn't the first time. The same horrifying screams had happened the last time the kiln was fired. Only Kiri's father had known the truth, before either of them could say another word. A loud voice exploded through the phone. "Mr. Gashima, I need to see your kiln." It was Shuichi. He had already rushed to the workshop. Kiri bolted out of bed without a second thought when she arrived. Shuichi was already standing in front of the roaring furnace. The old potter desperately tried to stop him. "Go home," but Shuichi refused to listen. His face turned pale as he stared at the blazing kiln. "I hear my mother. Someone's calling me from inside." The old man shouted that it was impossible, but it was too late. Shuichi grabbed a massive block of wood, and with every ounce of strength he had, he smashed it straight into the brick wall of the kiln. The entire structure shook violently. Bricks exploded outward, the wall cracked open, and in the next instant, a blinding burst of fire erupted from inside. What came pouring out wasn't ordinary flame. It was an unstoppable torrent of burning spiral souls. Hundreds of twisted faces surged forward together, screaming, wailing, stretching through the fire like a river of living nightmares. The workshop instantly transformed into a vision of hell. The cries echoed from every direction. "Heat, the heat!" Shuichi, flaming spiral creatures spilled across the floor, writhing through the burning debris as if they had finally escaped their prison. And standing before that impossible horror, Shuichi realized the nightmare he had feared all along was real. The moment the wall collapsed, the entire workshop became an inferno. Flames shot into the sky as the swarm of twisted spirits surged out of the shattered kiln. The old potter didn't care about himself anymore. He pointed at Shuichi and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Hurry and get out!" But before anyone could escape, the burning building gave one final groan. With a deafening crash, the roof collapsed. Shuichi, Kiri, and the others barely managed to jump back as the cottage disappeared beneath a sea of fire. Within moments, everything was gone: the workshop, the kiln, the old wooden house, reduced to nothing but ashes. As everyone stood there in stunned silence, someone shouted to call an ambulance. Smoke filled the night air, while Shuichi stared at the ruins, unable to believe what had just happened. The next morning, only blackened rubble remained. The mysterious kiln that had haunted the village for generations was nothing more than a broken shell. Everyone believed the nightmare was finally over after all. They had only lost a single kiln. But Kiri's father wasn't grieving. Instead, he wandered through the ruins with an unsettling smile on his face. As he scraped away the burned debris, something caught his eye: a strange spiral-shaped object, partially buried beneath the ashes. His eyes lit up with excitement. What a surprise! This turned out well. He carefully picked it up as though he had discovered buried treasure. Then with an almost obsessive grin he whispered, "There must be others buried around here." Even after the fire had destroyed everything, his obsession hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had only grown stronger. And what he planned to uncover beneath those ashes would reveal an even darker secret hidden inside the village. Days passed after the fire, yet the mystery surrounding Kuruzucho only grew deeper. Kiri slowly realized something disturbing. Across the town, ancient row houses still stood. Some were hidden between modern buildings, almost forgot by time. Others leaned dangerously, ready to collapse at any moment. And many sat abandoned on the outskirts, silently rotting away. It was as if the past refused to disappear. One afternoon, Kiri heard shouting from one of those old neighborhoods. A middle-aged man was furiously dragging his daughter away while screaming at a young boy. "I told you never to see her again." The girl, Yuriko, desperately struggled to break free. "Please, just let me talk to him." But her father refused to listen. He glared at the boy with pure hatred. "The next time I catch you with my daughter, you'll pay." Before anyone could stop him, the argument turned violent. Kazunori's older brother stepped forward and threw a punch, knocking Yuriko's father to the ground. The families exploded into another bitter fight. Watching from a distance, Kiri couldn't understand why they hated each other so much. When the crowd finally scattered, she walked over to the injured boy. "Kazunori, are you all right?" He slowly nodded before revealing the truth. Kazunori explained that their families had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember. Even though they lived at opposite ends of the same row house, their hatred never faded. Ironically, he and Yuriko had fallen in love. Since elementary school, they'd known each other. They had tried everything to convince their families, but nothing worked. Every meeting only made the adults then revealed something even stranger. His family lived inside one of the old row houses that had been renovated into cheap apartments. Poor families from across town ended up living there, but according to him, living in that place changed people. They're twisted. He explained that poverty alone wasn't the problem. Over time, the people living there became consumed by resentment. Their hearts slowly warped. Every tiny argument turned into uncontrollable hatred. No one could untangle the bitterness once it took root. Kiri immediately disagreed. "Not like them." Kazunori smiled sadly. "Kids don't notice these things, but it's been getting worse lately." After talking for a while, Kiri helped him walk back home. She had no idea that she was about to witness exactly what he meant. The moment they entered the apartment, the air itself felt heavy. Kazunori's father cursed Yuriko's family, swearing revenge. His exhausted mother blamed everyone except themselves. Through the paper-thin walls, the neighbors screamed back with equal hatred. Every insult passed straight through the building. One family mocked another's poverty. Another brought up gambling debts. Someone threatened murder. Within seconds, the entire row house had become one giant argument. The walls didn't separate anyone. They only carried every cruel word from one room to another. Kiri stood frozen as the endless shouting echoed from every direction. Then Kazunori couldn't take it anymore. He burst into tears and screamed with all his strength. I can't stand this anymore. I love Yuriko. Why can't you all stop fighting? Why can't we just get along? His desperate cries only shocked the adults into silence for a brief moment. Then he turned and ran. At the exact same time, Yuriko rushed out from the opposite end of the building, calling his name. The two raced toward each other, unaware that the curse surrounding the old row house was only beginning to reveal its true horror. Back at home, Kiri couldn't stop thinking about Kazunori and Yuriko. She quietly wished that, somehow, the two families would finally find peace. But Shuichi's expression immediately turned serious. He told her this wasn't an ordinary family feud. According to him, the people living inside those old row houses weren't fighting because of personality or bad luck. Their entire house had already fallen under the spiral's curse. The curse slowly twisted everyone's hearts until hatred became impossible to escape. If I'm not completely insane, Shuichi said, then everyone living there is doomed. Those chilling words left Kiri speechless, unable to accept that fate. Kiri suddenly made a desperate suggestion. What if we just leave this town? She even offered to run away that very night with Shuichi. For a moment it sounded like the only way to escape the curse. But Shuichi quietly stood up. Forget it. Won't ask for your help anymore. His cold answer left Kiri standing there in silence. Several days later, Kiri returned to the old row houses. Nothing had changed. The adults were screaming at each other once again. The same endless arguments, the same hatred. It was as if they couldn't even remember why they were fighting anymore. Then someone noticed Kiri. Kazunori's terrified mother rushed toward her. She revealed that Kazunori and Yuriko had disappeared together the day before. Instantly, both families blamed each other. One father shouted that Yuriko had seduced Kazunori. The other fired back, insisting Kazunori was the one corrupting his daughter, even while their children were missing. They cared more about accusing each other. Realizing the teenagers might be in danger, Kiri gathered everyone to search for them far outside town. Hidden inside an abandoned shack, Kazunori and Yuriko sat quietly together for the first time in what felt like forever. There was peace, but then, a strange scraping sound echoed through the empty building slowly. Something slithered beneath the broken floorboards. The sound grew louder, both of them froze, and then they saw it, two enormous snakes. Their bodies completely twisted together into one impossible spiral. The creatures moved as if locked in an endless embrace. Yuriko whispered nervously, "They're not fighting. They're making love." Kazunori stared at them in horror. No. Snakes slowly disappeared back beneath the floor, leaving an eerie silence behind. Meanwhile, Kiri finally found the abandoned shack. Peeking through the broken window, she saw Kazunori and Yuriko talking. Yuriko confessed that she couldn't bear living apart anymore. "I want to be with you forever." Kazunori looked into her eyes. "Then let's run away." She smiled through her tears. "Go anywhere, as long as we're together." Two embraced, believing they had finally found hope, but Kiri couldn't stop worrying. If they disappeared, what would happen to the families they left behind? Before she could think any further, voices echoed from outside. The parents had found them. The old men charged into the shack without hesitation. One of them immediately punched Kazunori so hard that he crashed onto the wooden floor. Yuriko screamed and tried to protect him. Kiri rushed forward, begging them to stop, but nobody listened. Once again, hatred had completely taken over, and this time, it looked like the spiral wasn't going to let anyone escape. Kiri rushed inside the abandoned shack and found Kazunori lying on the floor after being beaten by his own father. She knelt beside him, her voice filled with guilt. "If there's anything I can do to help, maybe the two of you really should run away." Kazunori painfully lifted his head and finally recognized her. "It's you." At that moment, neither of them noticed something horrifying. As Kazunori struggled to move, his body bent in an unnatural way, as if the spiral had already begun twisting him from the inside. The very next day, Kiri met Shuichi at the train station. Kazunori and Yuriko had promised to meet them there before leaving town forever. Shuichi nodded. "If they're really going to elope, we'll escort them to the station ourselves." It sounded like a solid plan, but just as they waited, Kazunori and Yuriko suddenly came running toward them, completely out of breath. Panic was written all over their faces. "Parents saw us leaving. They've got people waiting at the station. Our fathers are right behind us." There wasn't a second to waste. Shuichi quickly changed the plan. "We'll avoid the station. We're heading for the beach." Without hesitation, all four teenagers sprinted through the narrow streets of Kuruzucho. Unfortunately, their escape didn't last long. Both furious fathers appeared from opposite directions, blocking every possible route. The teenagers dodged into side streets, desperately trying to lose them. But the chase only grew more frantic. Finally, they burst onto the shoreline. The endless ocean stretched before them. For a brief second, it looked like freedom was finally within reach. Then another father stepped directly into their path. "There you are." The escape route was gone. Kazunori grabbed Yuriko's hand and pulled her forward. "Come on." The group raced across the sand while the adults chased after them. But running through deep sand drained everyone's strength. Yuriko stumbled. I can't make it." Before Kazunori could help her, her father caught up. He slammed his fist into Kazunori's face, sending him crashing into the sand. "Many times do I have to hit you before you understand?" The lovers were being torn apart once again. Kazunori looked toward Yuriko with desperate eyes. "They're separating us again." Then he shouted with every ounce of strength he had, "Yuriko, like before." Not this time, at first. She simply stared at him, her face became strangely calm, almost emotionless. Then, something impossible happened. A loud cracking sound echoed across the beach. Everyone watched in horror as Kazunori's entire body began twisting, his spine rotated, his arms curled, his legs wrapped around themselves, bone after bone cracked as his body transformed into a gigantic human spiral. The adults froze in terror. Kiri and Shuichi couldn't believe what they were seeing. Yuriko slowly looked down at herself, then her own body started twisting too, her arms stretched unnaturally, her waist rotated. Her entire body spiraled upward as if an invisible force was winding her tighter and tighter. Kazunori screamed her name. Yuriko, she reached toward him, he reached back for one brief moment. Their fingertips touched, then their hands locked together instead of pulling each other free. Their twisted bodies wrapped around one another, like the two snakes they had seen inside the abandoned shack. The lovers became one enormous living spiral. The spiral curse had finally claimed them completely. And what happened next was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before anyone could react, the two twisted bodies crashed onto the sand with a deafening impact. The gigantic human spiral kept tightening, each turn wrapping around the next until it looked harder than steel. Yuriko's father desperately grabbed the spiral, trying to pull his daughter free, but it was impossible. The twisted bodies wouldn't budge even an inch. They're like steel wire. Kiri, Shuichi, and the others could only watch in horror as the endless spiral continued to writhe across the beach. Then, from deep inside the spiral, Yuriko's gentle voice echoed out, "Stop it, father, we're never going to be apart. Forever," for the first time since all of this began. Both Kazunori and Yuriko looked completely at peace. The curse had stolen their human bodies, but no one could separate them anymore. The living spiral slowly began crawling toward the ocean. Every twist dragged itself across the sand, leaving a long trail behind. Everyone stood frozen. No one knew what they were even looking at anymore. The fathers screamed their children's names. "We'll save you," but it was already too late. The enormous spiral reached the shoreline without stopping. It slipped beneath the waves. The sea swallowed the lovers whole, and just like that, Kazunori and Yuriko disappeared forever. That was the last time anyone ever saw them, but the spiral curse of Kyoruzu-cho was far from over. If anything, it had only become even more terrifying. Tragedy at the beach left the entire town in shock, but the spiral curse wasn't finished yet. Just a few days later, another disturbing incident spread through the school. A student had fallen from the rooftop while showing off on the handrail. Everyone dismissed it as a reckless accident. He was always trying to get people's attention. Should never have done something so stupid. But Kiri couldn't stop thinking about something strange when she looked at the boy's lifeless body. His face wasn't filled with fear. Instead, he looked strangely satisfied, as if dying in front of a crowd had been exactly what he wanted. Later, Kiri discussed the incident with her quiet classmate Sekino. At first, Sekino hesitated, then she admitted something that sent chills down Kiri's spine. "I understand how he must have felt. I want people to notice me. I want everyone to look at me." Kiri stared at her in confusion. She had never heard Sekino talk like that before. The normally quiet girl suddenly confessed that she hated being invisible. She didn't know how to explain it. But lately she desperately wanted everyone to see her. When Kiri told Shuichi about Sekino's strange behavior, he immediately became serious. According to him, the spiral curse wasn't just twisting bodies anymore, it was twisting people's minds. This town is contaminated by the spiral. The spiral pulls people in, just like hypnosis, attracts attention. People infected by it become obsessed with being noticed. Suddenly, everything made sense. The rooftop accident, Sekino's sudden personality change, even Kazunori's obsession with Yuriko. The spiral wasn't only changing flesh, it was changing desires. As the conversation ended, Shuichi casually glanced at Kiri's hair. "It's getting pretty long." Kiri laughed. "It feels like it grew overnight." Neither of them realized that wasn't a joke. The very next morning, Kiri brushed her hair like always. But something felt wrong. Her hair seemed much longer than it had been the night before. At school, the moment she stepped into the hallway, every student turned to look at her for the first time in her life. She could feel everyone's eyes fixed on her. At first, she thought they were simply staring because her hair had grown, but then her friend gasped, "Kiri, what happened to your hair?" Confused, Kiri slowly turned around, and her heart nearly stopped. The ends of her beautiful hair had curled into perfect spirals, not one, not two, but dozens of hypnotic spiral curls hanging from every strand. No matter how much she touched them, they refused to straighten. Trying to stay calm, Kiri rushed into the restroom. "Maybe you should braid it," her friend suggested. It sounded like a good idea. Together they tied her hair into neat braids. For a brief moment, it looked normal again, but only seconds later, the braids began moving, twisting, turning. Curling by themselves, one after another, new spiral curls burst out from the braid as if her hair had developed a life of its own. The sound echoed through the classroom. Whirl, whirl, whirl. Kiri's face turned pale. This is unbearable. The curse had found its next victim. Desperate, Kiri rushed to a nearby beauty salon. "Don't understand. I haven't done anything to my hair. You just cut it off." The hairdresser smiled, lifted her scissors, and with one clean snip, she cut into Kiri's long hair. But the instant the blade sliced through, something impossible happened. The severed hair exploded into motion like hundreds of living snakes. Every strand whipped through the air, wrapping around the horrified hairdresser. The salon instantly descended into chaos, and what those living strands did next was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The moment the scissors sliced through Kiri's hair, everyone expected the nightmare to end. Instead, it became even worse. The severed hair suddenly sprang to life, wrapping around the terrified hairdresser like dozens of giant snakes. Within seconds, the salon erupted into panic. The horrified woman pointed at Kiri and screamed, You're a monster." Kiri stood frozen in disbelief. She never wanted any of this. Then Kiri revealed the terrifying truth. After the curse began, her hair started growing at an impossible speed. It moved on its own, as if it were a living creature, every time someone tried to cut it. The hair immediately wrapped around her neck and tried to strangle her. Her own family had rushed her to the hospital, but even doctors couldn't help. The cursed hair attacked anyone who got too close. It was no longer just hair, it had become something alive. Eventually, Kiri stopped resisting, but the nightmare refused to stop. Her hair continued dancing endlessly, twisting itself into perfect spirals over and over again. It almost looked beautiful. Until her parents noticed something horrifying. They couldn't look away, their eyes became empty, their faces froze. The spiral patterns had completely captured their minds without realizing it. They were already hypnotized. Only then did Kiri understand the true power of the curse. Her hair wasn't simply alive, it could mesmerize anyone who looked directly at it. Just like Shuichi had warned, the spiral attracted attention, and now Kiri herself had become the center of that attraction. The next day at school, students stopped walking the moment they saw her. Teachers forgot what they were doing. Everyone silently gathered around Kiri. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. They simply stared. Her living spiral hair had turned the entire hallway into an audience, and the more people watched, the larger and more elaborate the curls became. The curse was feeding on attention soon. Her hair transformed into enormous floating spiral discs that stretched high above everyone's heads. The entire school stood hypnotized. Some students stared with fear, others with admiration. Nobody could look away, even the teachers became victims. One of them shouted desperately, Gashima, fix your hair right now. But it was already too late. The spiral had everyone's eyes. After school, Kiri walked home with Shuichi. He quietly admitted something that made her even more uncomfortable. I'm impressed. You always said you hated attention. Now you stand out more than anyone beside them. Sekino smiled. She wasn't frightened, she was jealous. It must be nice. Everyone who looks at you is completely captivated. Then she whispered something unsettling. Stand out too, you just wait and see. Those words sent a chill down Kiri's spine. As Kiri passed through the crowded train station, her cursed hair suddenly expanded. It stretched outward like giant branches, more and more, until it surrounded an enormous crowd of people. The spiral wanted something bigger. It wanted more eyes, more attention, a larger audience. Kiri realized she wasn't controlling the hair anymore. The hair itself was choosing where to go. Just then, Shuichi finally arrived. The moment he saw Kiri surrounded by hundreds of hypnotized people, his face turned pale. He immediately understood how serious the situation had become. Meanwhile, Kiri could barely stay standing. The endless growth of her hair was draining all of her strength. Every single day, it became larger, heavier, hungrier, and no matter how exhausted she became, the spiral never stopped growing. The next morning, the entire school gasped. Kiri's hair had grown into a massive forest of living spirals towering above her head. Students crowded around again, whispering, pointing, staring, exactly what the curse wanted. Then someone stepped forward. It was Sekino, but something was terribly wrong. Her own hair had transformed as well, dark, glossy, covered in gigantic spiral curls that floated proudly above her head. She smiled calmly at Kiri. See, now I finally have something worth looking at. I won't lose to you. At that moment, Kiri understood this was no longer about survival. The spiral curse had created a new obsession, a battle for attention, and from that day forward, the entire school became the stage for a terrifying competition between two girls, whose living hair continued growing, twisting, and displaying itself before hundreds of helpless spectators. But neither of them realized the spiral was only beginning to reveal its true purpose. The battle had finally begun. Neither girl cared about the pain anymore. There was only one thing that mattered: attention. Sekino glared at Kiri with bloodshot eyes and shouted, only one of us deserves all this attention. Admit defeat. Kiri could barely stay on her feet. Her body trembled from exhaustion. Every breath felt heavier than the last. But Sekino had already lost her mind. With a furious scream, her living hair shot forward like a gigantic black spear. The attack came so fast that the air itself seemed to split apart. The massive strands wrapped around Kiri's neck in an instant. She gasped desperately for air as the cursed hair tightened like a noose. Then Kiri's own hair reacted. Without waiting for her command, it lunged forward. The two monstrous masses of hair slammed into each other with terrifying force. Thousands of strands twisted together like giant serpents wrestling for dominance. The entire schoolyard watched in complete silence. Nobody dared interfere. Everyone remained hypnotized by the impossible spectacle unfolding before their eyes. Kiri screamed in agony. She could no longer breathe. The curse was slowly crushing the life out of her. Just when it seemed everything was over, Shuichi charged straight through the crowd. Ignoring the danger, he rushed directly toward Kiri with a pair of scissors in his hand. Without hesitation, he slashed at the thick strands choking her neck. One clean cut, the deadly grip loosened. Kiri collapsed to the ground, desperately sucking in. Shuichi didn't stop. He knew the only way to save her was to destroy the source of the curse. He grabbed Kiri's endless hair with both hands, cutting it all off. The scissors flashed again and again, and again massive bundles of hair fell to the ground one after another. The endless river of living hair finally began shrinking for the first time in days. Kiri's body relaxed. She had become so weak that she couldn't even keep her eyes open. As the final strands collapsed behind her like a giant coiled rope, she quietly lost consciousness. Sekino stared at the scene in disbelief. Then she burst into hysterical laughter. "I won. I'm the most attractive girl in town now." Her smile twisted into something completely inhuman. She spread her arms wide toward the hypnotized crowd. "Everyone, follow me." The people obeyed without a word like sleepwalkers. They slowly followed their new queen. The spiral had completely consumed her mind meanwhile. Shuichi knelt beside Kiri. He gently held her as she slowly opened her eyes. She was breathing again, but she looked completely drained. Shuichi finally understood the horrifying truth. "The hair. It must have been draining all your strength just to keep growing." Kiri nodded weakly. Every second the cursed hair existed, it had been feeding on her life far away. Sekino continued wandering through the town, laughing louder and louder. Her towering spiral hair reached high into the sky. She begged everyone to look at her, to admire her, to worship her, but no matter how many people stared, it still wasn't enough. The curse had created an endless hunger. The more attention she received, the more attention she craved. Completely exhausted, Sekino leaned against a utility pole to catch her breath. Then, something unbelievable happened. Her living hair slowly wrapped itself around the pole once, twice, again, and again. The strands tightened into perfect spirals as they climbed higher and higher. Sekino watched with a tired smile. She didn't realize it yet, but the spiral had already chosen its next horrifying transformation, and what happened to Sekino next would become one of the most terrifying tragedies Kyorazucho had ever witnessed. Sekino's laughter slowly faded. For the first time since the curse took over, she looked exhausted. Every breath came out as a painful gasp. Her body trembled violently while her enormous spiral hair continued climbing higher and higher around the telephone pole. It was no longer obeying her. It was simply growing on its own. Then something horrifying happened. The strands wrapped tighter around the pole, dragging Sekino's body upward with them. She tried to pull herself free, but she didn't have the strength anymore. Her arms shook, her legs gave way beneath her. The curse had drained almost every ounce of life from her. Her skin rapidly became pale, her cheeks collapsed inward, her eyes sank deep into their sockets. Within moments, the beautiful girl who had desperately wanted everyone's attention looked like nothing more than a walking corpse. Yet, the hair never stopped growing. It continued spiraling toward the sky, feeding on whatever little life she had left. The terrified crowd could only watch. Nobody moved, nobody even spoke. Everyone stood frozen as Sekino's body slowly withered before their eyes. She was no longer a person. She had become nothing more than fuel for the spiral still clinging to the telephone pole. She stared into the distance with lifeless eyes. Her mouth hung open. Her breathing became weaker and weaker until it finally stopped. Sekino died standing beneath the very hair she had once treasured more than anything, but even death couldn't stop the curse. Her massive spiral hair remained wrapped around the telephone pole. For hours, it continued moving by itself. The endless curls slowly twisted through the power lines like living vines, silently displaying themselves to anyone unfortunate enough to look. It was as if the spiral wanted everyone in Kyorazucho to witness its newest masterpiece, and with Sekino gone, it became terrifyingly clear that the curse didn't need its victims anymore. The spiral had already become a living force of its own, and this was only another step toward the unimaginable nightmare waiting for the entire town. After witnessing yet another horrifying death, life in Kyorazucho tried to return to normal. But the town had already changed. Everyone carried an invisible fear, even if they refused to talk about it. Meanwhile, Kiri found herself dealing with a completely different problem. Back in middle school, there was a 7th grade boy named Mitsuru Yamaguchi. Everyone knew him by one strange nickname, Jack in the Box. Reason was simple. His favorite hobby was hiding around corners and suddenly jumping out to scare people. No matter who walked by, Mitsuru would leap out with a huge grin, convinced that frightening people was the funniest thing in the world. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an annoying habit, but one day Kiri realized something disturbing. The boy wasn't trying to scare everyone anymore, he was following her. Every afternoon he would appear from behind walls, hallways, and staircases, shouting her name and asking her out. The constant surprises quickly became exhausting, and Kiri began avoiding him whenever she could. Even her friend Shiho noticed how uncomfortable she was. They hurried home together, hoping Mitsuru wouldn't find them again on their way to school. The girls took the usual shortcut through the town cemetery. Walking between endless rows of gravestones already felt unsettling. But after everything that had happened in Kyorazucho, even a quiet cemetery no longer felt safe. Shiho suddenly mentioned something she had recently heard. Apparently the town had stopped cremating its dead. Instead, people were being buried. When Kiri asked why, Shiho reminded her of the strange black spiral smoke that always rose from the crematorium whenever someone from Kyorazucho was cremated. Some blamed faulty equipment, others blamed the weather. But no matter where the body was cremated, if the person belonged to this town, the smoke always twisted into a perfect black spiral. As if the curse refused to let anyone escape, Kiri couldn't help wondering, if the spiral cursed everyone in town, And maybe burying the dead was simply another desperate attempt to hide its influence. Still, walking through a cemetery filled with actual bodies wasn't exactly comforting either. The girls nervously picked up their pace then. Without the slightest warning, "Boo!" Mitsuru exploded out from behind a gravestone. The girls screamed in terror before realizing who it was. Instead of feeling guilty, Mitsuru laughed proudly. He apologized, claiming he never meant to upset Kiri. "It's just my habit to surprise people." But Kiri had reached her limit. She bluntly told him to leave her alone. Shiho scolded him too, explaining that frightening the girl he liked would never make her fall for him. Even after hearing that Kiri already liked someone else, Mitsuru refused to give up. He boldly declared that he wanted such a beautiful girlfriend so everyone would envy him. As Kiri and Shiho walked away, he shouted after her with complete confidence, "Go out with me eventually." From that day on, the harassment only got worse. Mitsuru followed Kiri everywhere. He screamed his love from bridges. He hid inside trash cans just to jump out at her. He shouted beneath her bedroom window late at night. He even wished he could reach directly into her room. Then one afternoon, a delivery arrived at Kiri's house. Inside was another gift from Mitsuru. Realizing she couldn't ignore him forever, Kiri met him face to face and handed the unopened package back. She spoke honestly. Every surprise, every unwanted gift, every interruption was only making her dislike him more. Mitsuru looked heartbroken. For a moment it seemed like he finally understood. He quietly admitted that maybe he had been approaching everything the wrong way. But then, an absurd idea suddenly flashed across his face. His eyes widened. "I saw something like this on TV." Before Kiri could stop him, he sprinted straight into the middle of the road. Throwing his arms wide open, he stood directly in front of an oncoming car. "My love for you will stop this car." The driver slammed on the brakes, tires screamed across the pavement, and the speeding vehicle raced straight toward him. What happened next would prove that even something as innocent as love could become another victim of the spiral curse. The next second, a deafening crash echoed across the street. Kiri screamed Mitsuru's name, but it was already too late. The speeding car never stopped. Instead, it slammed straight into him with such terrifying force that his body became trapped beneath the front wheel. His head twisted unnaturally around the tire. Blood slowly dripped onto the pavement, and the horrifying sight left everyone completely frozen. The boy who believed love could stop a speeding car had been crushed in an instant. News of the accident spread through town almost immediately. Students whispered through the school hallways, unable to believe what had happened. Some said his body had been wedged so tightly inside the wheel that rescuers needed a blowtorch just to remove him. Others claimed the damage was so severe that his funeral would have to be held with a completely closed casket. Kiri couldn't erase the image from her mind, no matter how hard she tried. His smiling face kept appearing in her memories, and then, her eyes slowly drifted toward the small gift box Mitsuru had given her before he died. She had never opened it until now. The package was wrapped neatly. A tiny note rested on top, "With love, Mitsuru." After staring at it for several seconds, Kiri finally unlocked the tiny clasp. Click, the lid slowly lifted. Tiny Jack-in-the-Box clown suddenly burst into the air. Kiri jumped in surprise. At first she almost laughed. Even after death, Mitsuru had managed to scare her one last time, or at least that's what she wanted to believe. That evening, Kiri called Shuichi. Her voice was trembling. She blamed herself for everything that had happened, but Shuichi tried to comfort her. "It wasn't your fault." A brief moment. His words helped calm her down. Then, behind Kiri, the Jack-in-the-Box slowly turned its head without anyone touching it. The little clown leaned toward her, and in a cold, unnatural voice, it whispered, "It is your fault." Kiri froze. The toy wasn't supposed to move, it wasn't supposed to speak, yet its glassy eyes stared directly at her. "You know he died for you. Now, he'll come back for you." The room echoed with Kiri's terrified scream. The next night, Kiri and Shuichi made an unbelievable decision. If Mitsuru really was coming back, then they had to make sure he stayed dead. Armed with flashlights, a shovel, a crowbar, and even a wooden stake, the two quietly slipped into the cemetery under the cover of darkness. Neither of them wanted to be there, but fear pushed them forward. Kiri admitted she couldn't believe what they were doing. Shuichi agreed. Yet after everything the spiral curse had already done, nothing seemed impossible anymore. His plan was simple: dig up Mitsuru's grave, and if the body showed any sign of returning, drive a stake straight through his heart. It sounded insane, but believing a cursed toy could talk was already insane. So at this point, anything was possible. After searching through countless gravestones, they finally found the fresh mound of earth. This must be it. Taking a deep breath, Shuichi drove the shovel into the ground. The cemetery fell completely silent. Only the sound of dirt being thrown aside echoed through the night. Minute after minute, the hole grew deeper. The smell of decay slowly began rising from below. Kiri covered her nose in horror, but Shuichi didn't stop. He grabbed the crowbar and prepared to pry open the coffin. Neither of them knew that what waited inside would become one of the most disturbing sights the spiral curse had ever created. And once the coffin opened, there would be no turning back. The moment Shuichi forced the crowbar under the coffin lid, wham, something inside suddenly exploded upward. For a split second, both of them thought the corpse had attacked, but Shuichi quickly realized the pressure inside the sealed coffin had blown the small viewing window open. Even so, the unbearable stench pouring out of the grave almost made them vomit. Taking a deep breath, Shuichi tightened his grip on the crowbar. "Let's get this over with." Then, he pulled. Bang, the coffin burst open. Both of them instinctively stepped backward. Inside lay Mitsuru, or at least, What was left of him, his skin had turned gray and rotten, his stitched, crushed face stared straight upward, his swollen white eyes looked ready to burst from their sockets, black saliva leaked endlessly from his mouth. It wasn't just a corpse anymore, it looked like something that had crawled out of a nightmare before either of them could react. The corpse suddenly jerked. Bam! Its entire body shot straight out of the coffin like a released spring, its arms stretched wide, its mouth hung unnaturally open, and an inhuman scream echoed through the cemetery for one horrifying second. The dead boy was standing right in front of them. Shuichi's face turned pale. "Kiri, run!" The two immediately turned and sprinted through the rows of gravestones behind them. Mitsuru didn't walk, he bounced. Every leap launched his lifeless body several meters into the air before crashing back onto the ground. Biwam, whoosh, his movements weren't human, they were violent. Random, like a grotesque puppet thrown around by invisible forces. Kiri couldn't believe her eyes. How can he move like that? Even Shuichi had no answer. Then something even more disturbing happened. With every massive jump, pieces of Mitsuru's rotting body began tearing away. His stomach split open, his organs slipped free. Chunks of flesh peeled from his legs, each landing shattered him a little more, yet somehow, he kept chasing them almost as if the curse refused to let him stop. Shuichi realized the horrifying truth. His body's so rot, it's literally falling apart. But the monster didn't care. Even as it destroyed itself, it continued bouncing toward them. Finally, one especially violent impact ripped Mitsuru's lower body completely apart. His corpse crashed face first into the ground. For a moment, everything became silent. Shuichi and Kiri stopped running, both of them gasped for air. I think it's over." Neither of them moved, neither of them dared breathe. Then, the corpse's head slowly lifted, its empty eyes locked onto Kiri once again, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, and with another horrifying shriek, it launched itself through the air. But this time, the truth behind its impossible jumps was finally revealed. The broken spine hanging from Mitsuru's body suddenly stretched into a gigantic spring. Every bounce came from his own backbone, twisting and compressing like the jack-in-the-box Mitsuru had given Kiri before he died. Shuichi stared in complete horror. What the hell? His spine became a spring. The curse hadn't simply brought Mitsuru back, it had transformed him into a living jack-in-the-box. And now the monster was only getting closer, just when they thought the nightmare couldn't get any worse. Mitsuru launched himself straight toward them once again. His spring-like spine compressed with terrifying force before sending his mangled body flying through the air. Mouth stretched impossibly wide as he let out another horrifying scream, reaching for Kiri with rotten hands. For a moment, it looked like he was about to grab her, but fate had one final surprise. As Mitsuru slammed into the ground again, boing, something suddenly flew out of his body. A heavy steel coil bounced across the cemetery before rolling to a stop. Shuichi stared in disbelief. That's an automobile suspension spring. Then everything finally made sense. The spring from the front wheel of the car that had killed Mitsuru had never been removed from his body. It had remained lodged inside him all this time, becoming part of the curse itself. That was why he had bounced like a giant jack-in-the-box. The horrifying transformation wasn't supernatural alone. It was the accident itself that had completed the nightmare. Without the metal spring supporting him anymore, Mitsuru's body collapsed. His rotting corpse hit the ground with a sickening thud. The endless bouncing stopped. His empty eyes stared into nothing. The monster that had terrorized them only moments ago finally became still. And the cursed jack-in-the-box would never surprise anyone again. But neither Kiri nor Shuichi felt relieved. Standing in the silent graveyard, both of them could only stare at the horrifying remains. They had survived. Yet every terrifying event in this town seemed connected by one impossible force. The spiral curse was still spreading, and deep down, they knew this nightmare was far from over. The nightmare of the jack-in-the-box was finally over. But in Kuruzu town, peace never lasted for long. A few days later, dark clouds gathered once again. Rain poured endlessly over the town, drumming against the classroom windows as everyone watched the gloomy weather outside. One student casually remarked that the rain might continue for several more days. Then another student mentioned something strange. "I bet Kajiyama comes today." Kiri looked confused. Apparently there was a boy who only showed up to school whenever it rained. No one knew why. But somehow every rainy day brought him back. As the teacher began the lesson, the classroom door slowly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Kajiyama. His entire body was dripping with rainwater. His clothes clung tightly to his skin and water poured off him as if he had just climbed out of a river. Yet despite his miserable appearance, he wore an oddly peaceful smile. The teacher sighed. "Late again, Kajiyama." The soaking wet boy apologized politely. "I got up early, but it took a while." Immediately, the class burst into laughter. Everyone knew Kajiyama as the slowest person in school. It took him forever to do even the simplest things. The teacher couldn't even stay angry. He simply told Kajiyama to take his seat and reminded him to buy an umbrella. But Kajiyama only stared blankly, as if he couldn't understand why everyone kept asking the same question. Later that day, the class headed to the gym for volleyball. The match started normally. Players dove across the floor. The ball flew back and forth. Everyone moved quickly. Except Kajiyama, he barely reacted. He stood almost perfectly still while the ball dropped right beside him. His teammates exploded with anger. "What are you, a statue? You cost us the game." They blamed him for everything. Kajiyama didn't argue, he simply stood there, smiling quietly. Unable to defend himself after class, several boys cornered him inside the locker room. They mocked him, laughed at how slow he was, then the bullying became cruel. They decided to strip off his wet clothes themselves. Kageyama begged them to stop, but his weak voice only made them laugh harder. They dragged him onto the floor while everyone watched in horror. Even Kiri froze. She wanted to help, but everything happened too fast then. The laughter suddenly stopped. One of the boys noticed something on Kageyama's back. Perfect spiral, dark, beautiful, and terrifying. It covered almost his entire back like a giant shell growing beneath his skin. The room fell silent. No one had ever seen anything like it before anyone could react. Kageyama's body suddenly began moving on its own slowly. His stomach pressed against the floor. His body slid forward, leaving a long trail of water behind him, not like a person, but like a snail. Everyone stared in complete disbelief. The spiral wasn't just a strange mark, it was alive. The next day, things became even worse. Kageyama returned to school once again. His back had swollen so much that everyone could see the enormous hump beneath his soaked shirt. The wet fabric clung tightly against it, revealing the massive spiral underneath. Kiri couldn't take her eyes off it. It looks like spiral rising. Her friend whispered nervously, "No, it looks like a snail." The word sent chills down Kiri's spine, because deep inside, she knew exactly what that meant, and whatever was growing inside Kageyama had only just begun. The curse refused to slow down. Every single day the rain continued, and every single day Kageyama's body changed even more. By Wednesday, the strange lump on his back had grown enormous. It no longer looked like a swollen spine. It looked exactly like a giant snail shell pushing its way out of his body. Even the teacher could barely hide his shock, but Kageyama simply smiled his usual empty smile. "Sorry I'm late," as though nothing was wrong. The very next day, things became far worse. Kageyama arrived at the classroom door once again, then suddenly, his swollen back began to move. The shell cracked upward, his entire body collapsed onto all fours, and before everyone's horrified eyes, Kageyama transformed. His skin thickened into a slimy spotted surface. His shell finished growing. His arms stretched across the floor. He wasn't just carrying a shell anymore. He had become a gigantic human snail. The classroom erupted into screams. Desks were shoved aside as students scrambled to escape. But Kageyama didn't attack anyone. He simply crawled forward, slowly squeezing between desks, leaving behind a thick trail of sticky slime. His human face still wore the same gentle smile, making the entire scene even more disturbing. By Friday, the rain still hadn't stopped. Students suddenly spotted something impossible outside the school. Someone shouted, "Look, he's on the wall." Everyone rushed to the windows. There, clinging effortlessly to the side of the school building, was Kageyama. His enormous shell weighed almost as much as his body, yet he crawled straight up the vertical wall as naturally as any ordinary snail. The rain seemed to make him stronger. Every inch he climbed left behind a glistening trail of slime across the concrete. Then, another horrifying change began. Eyes slowly stretched outward, long stalks pushed from his face. His human eyes disappeared to the tips of the stalks. Exactly like a snail, Kiri could only stare in disbelief. There was no denying it anymore. The spiral curse wasn't changing him, it was replacing him. Someone whispered in terror, "He's cursed by the spiral." And no one could disagree. The teachers immediately contacted Kageyama's parents. His family rushed to the school hoping to bring their son home. But the moment they looked up, they froze. High above them, their son crawled across the school walls like some giant creature from a nightmare. His own parents couldn't believe what they were seeing. "That can't be our son." The words barely escaped their mouths. School staff tried everything. Using long poles, they carefully pushed him away from the wall while workers waited below with a giant safety net. Eventually, the enormous snail fell into the net with a heavy crash. But the nightmare didn't end there. When his terrified parents were asked to take him home, they refused. They simply couldn't accept that this monster had once been their child. So the school had no choice. They built a fenced enclosure and kept Kageyama inside it like an animal. Day after day, students gathered outside the cage to stare. Some watched in silence, others laughed. Sumura, the same bully who had humiliated Kageyama before, couldn't stop mocking him. "He's not human anymore. He's just a slug," he laughed as he poked Kageyama through the fence with a stick. Kiri immediately shouted, "Stop it, leave him alone." But Sumura only laughed harder. To him, Kageyama wasn't a person anymore, he was just entertainment. But no one realized the spiral curse was far from finished. And anyone who treated it like a joke would soon regret it. Days passed, and eventually, the endless rain finally came to an end. The moment the skies cleared, something strange happened. Kageyama completely retreated inside his shell. He didn't move, he didn't come out. It was as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, under the blazing summer sun, everyone around town suddenly became unbelievably thirsty. People crowded around drinking fountains. Some students couldn't stop gulping down water, no matter how much they drank. It never seemed to be enough, almost as if their bodies were drying out from the inside. Then, something even stranger happened. The bully Sumura, the same boy who had mocked Kageyama every day, suddenly stopped coming to school. No one knew where he had gone. At first, everyone assumed he was skipping class, but as more days passed, his disappearance became impossible to ignore. Watching Kageyama hide inside his shell, Kiri became worried. He hasn't come out because it hasn't rained. Her friend suggested spraying him with water. Maybe that would help him survive. Kiri hesitated. What if he shows his face again? The last time she'd seen him, his horrifying transformation was burned into her memory forever. Still, leaving him to slowly die from dehydration felt even worse. so the two girls made a decision. They grabbed a garden hose, turned on the water, and carefully sprayed the shell for a few seconds. Nothing happened then. The shell began to tremble, water poured across its spiral surface. A slimy body slowly pushed outward, the shell lifted. Kageyama emerged once again, his long eye stalks rising into the air as if waking from hibernation. The moment he came out, the girls screamed and ran even though they had wanted to help him. Actually seeing the monster move again was too terrifying to endure. A few days later, the teacher made an announcement. Sumira has been missing for several days. If anyone knows where he is, please tell me. Classroom fell silent. Everyone remembered the last time they had seen him, laughing at Kageyama's suffering, but no one knew where he had disappeared, or so they thought. Outside, the rain had started falling again. Kiri stared absent-mindedly through the classroom window. Then she noticed something moving across the wet glass. At first, it looked exactly like Kageyama. Students screamed in panic. Kageyama escaped, but as the creature crawled closer, everyone realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't Kageyama, it was Sumira. His body had also transformed into a gigantic human snail. His face was twisted beyond recognition. Yet everyone could still identify the bully who once laughed at Kageyama. The spiral curse had claimed another victim soon. The school placed both snail creatures inside the same enclosure. At first, everyone expected them to fight. Instead, they slowly crawled toward one another. Then they gently touched. Kiri watched in confusion. What are they doing? Someone suddenly remembered a strange biological fact. Snails are hermaphrodites, another student replied in disbelief. But they're both male. Then realization struck everyone at once. They're mating. No one could believe what they were witnessing. Spiral curse had completely erased what was left of their humanity. Several weeks later, both giant snails disappeared. At first, everyone thought they had somehow climbed over the fence, but when they inspected the enclosure, they found a tunnel. The creatures had dug straight through the earth. Following the tunnel, the students discovered a long trail of fresh slime stretching into the distance. The trail disappeared deep into the mountains. Without saying another word, Kiri, Shuichi, and the others decided to follow it. None of them realized the horrifying answer waiting in those hills would be far worse than anything they had imagined. Following the slimy trail deep into the forest, the group suddenly froze, hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves. They discovered dozens of strange white eggs. For a moment, nobody could even speak. Then Shuichi whispered, one of them laid eggs. The horrifying truth finally became impossible to deny. Kageyama and Sumira weren't human anymore. They had completely become mollusk creatures. Looking at the pile of eggs, one student nervously muttered, they look like tennis balls. But no one found it funny. Before anyone could react, Mr. Yakoda suddenly stepped forward without hesitation. He raised his foot and violently crushed the eggs beneath his shoe. Crack, crunch, one after another. The eggs burst apart. The girls screamed. Mr. Yakoda, what are you doing? Breathing heavily, the teacher answered without regret, it's disgusting, unnatural. These creatures must never reproduce. Moments later, the entire nest had been destroyed, yet something still felt wrong. Despite searching every corner of the forest, they never found another batch of eggs, and more importantly, neither Kageyama nor Sumira were anywhere to be seen. Whatever they had become, they were still out there, and the nightmare was far from over. Several days later, rain once again soaked the school. The classroom door slowly creaked open. At first, everyone thought it was just another ordinary day. Then something enormous began sliding across the classroom floor. A giant spiral shell, a bloated slug-like body, and covering its entire back, hundreds, no, thousands of eggs. The horrifying creature slowly crawled into the classroom. It was Mr. Yakoda, the same teacher who had crushed the eggs in the forest. Now, the spiral curse had claimed him as well, but unlike the others, his transformation had become something even more terrifying, and as the students stared in absolute horror, they realized this nightmare had only just begun. Just when everyone thought the horrors couldn't get any stranger, a new nightmare began. Late one night, the abandoned lighthouse standing on the cliffs of Kuruzucho suddenly came back to life. Without warning, a blinding white light exploded from its tower, but it wasn't shining like a normal lighthouse. Instead, the beam twisted into a gigantic spiral, sweeping across the town like a glowing tornado. Its deep humming echoed through the night. As if the lighthouse itself had awakened, the strange phenomenon quickly attracted everyone's attention. Residents gathered near the shore, staring at the impossible sight. That lighthouse abandoned. What's making it work again? Nobody had an answer. The beam continued spinning, again and again, every single night. For just a brief moment, the light would sweep across the crowd before disappearing into the darkness. Most people simply watched in amazement, but Kiri immediately sensed something wasn't right. Even a quick glance at the light made her feel dizzy. Back home, her little brother Mitsuo excitedly called it a giant robot firing a death ray. Everyone laughed except Kiri. Looking toward the lighthouse with growing fear, she warned, "Don't stare at that light. There's something wrong with it." Her mother quietly agreed. "I don't like it either. It makes me feel sick." Whatever was hidden inside that lighthouse, it wasn't meant to be seen. As complaints from frightened residents continued to grow, a group of town workers finally decided to investigate. The strange part was, that lighthouse had been abandoned for years. It shouldn't even have electricity, yet every single night, it shined brighter than ever. Determined to uncover the truth, the workers unlocked the heavy entrance and slowly stepped inside. None of them realized they were walking straight toward another spiral nightmare. That evening, the mysterious light returned once again. A brilliant flash burst from the lighthouse. and the enormous spiral beam rolled across the town like a living wave. Hundreds of people stood silently, unable to look away. The hypnotic glow filled their vision, and something invisible seemed to settle deep inside their minds. No one understood it at the time, but that single glance would soon change the entire town. The effects appeared almost immediately. People began behaving in ways that made no sense. An elderly woman slowly spun in circles while walking home, round and round, as if her body had forgot how to move normally. Concerned, Kiri rushed over. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The old woman calmly replied, "I'm just walking home. It's taking longer than usual." She didn't even realize she was spinning endlessly instead of walking straight. Soon, more people started doing the exact same thing. Entire crowds twisted through the streets in slow spirals. Panic spread across Kuruzu-cho. Then the situation became even worse. A terrified man screamed while spinning uncontrollably. "I can't stop. Please, someone help me." His eyes were filled with horror. "That swirling light, it's burned into my eyes." One after another, more victims appeared. Some spun around street corners, others circled through the station without realizing it, watching the town descend into madness. Kiri could only whisper, "Oh God, what's happening to everyone?" But the answer was still waiting inside the lighthouse, and what they would discover there was far more horrifying than anyone could imagine. As panic spread through the town, another disaster struck. By morning, a fishing boat had mysteriously run aground near the cape below the lighthouse. The strangest part, there hadn't been a single strong wind that night. The boat simply shouldn't have crashed. Worried residents gathered around the shore, exchanging rumors. One man quietly revealed something even more disturbing. After the boat hit the rocks, the entire crew had been found walking in circles across the deck, round and round, as if they had completely lost control of their bodies. Eventually, every one of them fell into the sea. Only one survivor was rescued. The other two simply disappeared. And then someone whispered another terrifying rumor. The workers who had entered the lighthouse to investigate had never come back either. Now there were even more missing people before anyone could stop them. A group of curious boys, including Kiri's little brother Mitsuo, rushed toward the lighthouse to get a closer look at the wrecked boat. Kiri's heart nearly stopped. "Mitsuo, wait," but the boys ignored her. "Be fine. You can see the boat better from the cape." Kiri desperately shouted, "Don't go over there, it's dangerous." Her warning was swallowed by the crashing waves. Without another choice, she ran after them. When Kiri finally reached the lighthouse, the boys were already standing beside the stranded boat. Then one of them pointed toward the entrance. Doors opened. Instantly, their curiosity overcame their fear. One after another, they stepped inside the abandoned lighthouse. "No, stop!" Kiri screamed, but it was already too late. The heavy doorway swallowed the children, and silence returned. Taking a deep breath, Kiri forced herself inside after them. The moment she entered, cold chill ran down her spine. The inside of the lighthouse was dark, except for the endless spiral staircase winding upward. "Mitsuo," her voice echoed through the tower. No answer, only silence. Then, a faint laugh drifted from somewhere above. "Haha, the stairs are awesome." It was Mitsuo, relieved. Kiri immediately started climbing. At first, the staircase seemed completely normal. Step after step, she kept climbing, but something felt wrong no matter how long she walked. The stairs never seemed to end. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. The walls slowly began changing. Strange spiral patterns appeared everywhere. They covered the stone walls, the ceiling, even the staircase beneath her feet. There were no windows inside, yet the spirals glowed faintly in the darkness, as if the lighthouse itself had become alive. Kiri whispered to herself, "The lighthouse has become part of the spiral." She continued climbing. Still, there was no top. No matter how far she walked, she always seemed to end up in the same place. "Feel like I'm just going around in circles, climbed forever, but I still can't reach the top." Soon, the air changed. A horrible smell drifted through the tower. "Smoke, burning. I can smell something burning." Her breathing became heavier. Fear clouded her thoughts. "I must be going crazy." Then she noticed something lying on the stairs. At first, it looked like twisted tree branches, but when she stepped closer, her blood froze. They weren't branches, they were blackened human arms. Charred skeletons lay scattered across the staircase, their bodies burned until nothing remained except bone. Kiri let out a terrified scream. Her mind raced. Were these missing adults? Then she counted them: 1, 2, 3 burned bodies, exactly the number of workers who had disappeared after entering the lighthouse. "Mitsuo, no." Panic completely took over. She screamed her brother's name over and over while running deeper into the tower. Voice echoed endlessly through the spiral walls. Finally, she found the boys. They were huddled together on the staircase, trembling with fear. For a brief moment, relief washed over Kiri, but when she looked past them, her heart nearly stopped again. There were 2 more burned bodies lying just beyond them. If these were the missing fishermen, then what terrible force inside this lighthouse had reduced every one of them to ashes? And worst of all, whatever had done it might still be waiting somewhere above. The frightened boys could barely speak. With tears in their eyes, they pointed farther up the tower. They kept going. They wanted to see. Kiri's heart sank. What about Mitsuo? "Where's the other boy?" The boys trembled as they answered. They went ahead. Realizing there wasn't a second to lose, Kiri ordered the 2 boys to head downstairs immediately. Without waiting for a reply, she rushed even higher into the lighthouse, stepping past the charred bodies that still littered the endless staircase. Finally, she reached the very top, and what she found there left her speechless. The lighthouse lamp was gone. Placed stood a gigantic mass of melted glass, dripping from the ceiling like a monstrous candle. Its center formed a perfect spiral. The strange object seemed almost alive, as if it were staring directly at them. The boys huddled together in terror. "It's looking at us." Too scared, Kiri forced herself to stay calm, then she realized something horrifying. This used to be the lighthouse lamp. The enormous Fresnel lens had completely melted from unimaginable heat as the glass softened. Its circular layers twisted into a gigantic spiral. Even the walls and floor looked as if the entire room had liquefied before hardening again. Then her eyes drifted back toward the burned bodies. What kind of temperature could melt solid glass and reduce human beings to blackened skeletons? Suddenly, a terrible thought crossed Kiri's mind. She looked through the lighthouse windows. The sun was already touching the horizon. Oh no, it's almost sunset. Her face turned pale. Every evening the lighthouse automatically switched on, and if its light was powerful enough to melt glass, then anyone inside would be burned alive. She grabbed the boys. We have to get out before the light turns on. Run, there's not a second to waste. The children sprinted toward the stairs. Their footsteps echoed wildly through the tower. No one dared look back. No one even asked questions anymore. They simply ran faster and faster outside. The last rays of sunlight disappeared beneath the sea then. The lighthouse awakened. A blinding white flash exploded from the giant lens. For a split second, the entire ocean became brighter than daylight. The children froze. Never make it. Then they heard it, a deep, roaring sound. The unbearable heat was racing down the staircase behind them. It's coming. The heat is coming. Kiri screamed. Don't look back. Just run. The walls shook violently as the wave of scorching air chased them through the spiral tower. One of the boys stumbled and nearly fell. Kiri grabbed him without slowing down, pulling him back onto his feet, but the blazing wave was getting closer every second then. With a deafening roar, the inferno caught them. An enormous blast of fire surged through the staircase like a living monster. The children were thrown through the air as the explosion swallowed the tower. For one horrifying moment, Kiri saw the boy disappear inside the flames. Then, everything went black when she finally opened her eyes. She was lying on the cold stone floor. The boys were scattered nearby, slowly regaining consciousness. For several seconds, no one understood what had happened. The only thing Kiri remembered was the blinding flash, the unbearable heat, and being blasted away by an explosion powerful enough to erase everything in its path. But the biggest mystery was only beginning. If the lighthouse had unleashed that impossible fire, then how were they still alive? And what exactly had protected them from becoming the next burned bodies inside the spiral tower? The roaring inferno finally faded away. Kiri slowly opened her eyes, her entire body aching from the explosion. The first thing she saw was Mitsuo lying unconscious beside her. His clothes were scorched and his skin was covered in painful burns. Mitsuo, she quickly shook him, praying he was still alive. A moment later, the boy finally opened his eyes. Kiri let out a long breath of relief. They had actually survived. Looking back toward the lighthouse, she whispered in disbelief, "We made it outside." Behind them, the lighthouse continued to roar, its terrifying spiral beam slicing through the darkness like a living monster. Even from a safe distance, the heat pouring from it felt overwhelming. Mitsuo winced in pain. "Kiri, it hurts." Trying to stay calm, she gently helped him sit up. "You were burned. Let's go home so we can take care of it." Nightmare was finally over, or so they believed. The next morning, authorities searched the lighthouse. Inside, they discovered 6 burned bodies. One of them belonged to a young boy. No one could explain exactly what had happened inside the tower that night. The lighthouse had become a place of fear. People whispered rumors about the impossible spiral, the unbearable heat, and the mysterious deaths hidden inside. Officials announced that the lighthouse would eventually be demolished, but until that day came, every single night, as the sun disappeared below the horizon, the lighthouse awakened once again. Its beam stretched across the sea, twisting into an unnatural spiral, as if the curse inside the tower had never ended. And anyone who looked at that eerie swirling light couldn't help but wonder how many more people would become victims of the spiral next. The nightmare inside the lighthouse was finally over, but the curse of the spiral was only beginning. That summer, Kuruzu town became overrun with mosquitoes. Everywhere Kiri looked, the irritating buzzing never stopped. After the burns she suffered in the lighthouse, she was forced to spend nearly half of her summer recovering in the hospital. Her injuries were far worse than anyone had expected. Mitsuo had escaped with lighter burns and had already been discharged, leaving Kiri to recover alone. At first, the mosquitoes seemed like nothing more than another annoying part of summer. But soon, Kiri realized something was terribly wrong. Whenever she watched them fly, they didn't move normally. They traced tiny spirals through the air, round and round. The longer she stared, the heavier her eyelids became. It was as if the spirals themselves were hypnotizing her. Before she even realized it, one mosquito landed on her skin and bit her. That year, even the mosquitoes had fallen under the spiral's curse. Days later, Kiri was finally well enough to leave the hospital for a short walk. Her legs still hurt. Every step reminded her of the burns she had suffered inside the lighthouse. While talking with her friend, a strange buzzing echoed through the air. At first, Kiri thought it was a small whirlwind. But when she looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. Thousands of mosquitoes were spinning together in a giant twisting pillar that stretched high into the sky. Her friend explained that people called it a mosquito column. Male mosquitoes gathered like that while waiting for females. But Kiri couldn't stop staring. It wasn't just a swarm, it was another perfect spiral, another impossible sign that the curse was spreading. Before she could think any further, something caught her eye in the bushes nearby. Lying motionless among the plants was the body of a woman. Her skin was covered in mosquito bites, her face was pale, her eyes were empty. It looked as though every drop of blood had been drained from her body, and deep inside, Curie knew this was only the beginning. The hospital quickly descended into chaos. More ambulances arrived one after another. Victims of violent mosquito attacks were flooding the emergency rooms. Among them was Curie's own cousin Keiko. She was pregnant. Her body was covered with countless bites and she looked dangerously weak. Keiko admitted she couldn't keep any food down. She vomited everything she ate and felt completely exhausted. The nurses believed the illness was mostly psychological, but Curie wasn't convinced. Something about all of this felt horribly unnatural. When a nurse asked Curie to unpack Keiko's belongings, she discovered something strange inside the bag. Wrapped carefully in cloth was an unbelievably heavy object. As Curie lifted it into her hands, she had no idea that this mysterious package was connected to the terrifying events that were about to unfold the very next morning. Screams echoed throughout the hospital. Patients were dying, one after another. Doctors rushed from room to room only to discover more bodies. Every victim looked exactly the same. Their skin was riddled with tiny holes, their faces were frozen in agony, and their bodies looked almost completely drained of blood. Nobody understood what was happening. But one horrifying truth became impossible to ignore. The mosquito outbreak had reached the hospital itself, and the spiral was claiming its next victims. The hospital had turned into a place of fear. No one knew what had killed the patients overnight. The only sound left echoing through the halls was the endless buzzing of mosquitoes. Even Keiko, despite being covered in bites, tried to reassure Curie. Then she smiled weakly and placed a hand on her stomach. Little monsters finally started kicking. A brief moment, everything almost felt normal again. But that feeling didn't last long. Later that day, Shuichi finally came to visit Curie. She was happy to see him after so long. Yet the moment he stepped inside the hospital, his expression became unusually serious. He slowly looked around the room, then quietly whispered, "There's something wrong with this hospital." Before Curie could ask what he meant, a nurse entered with unexpected news. The maternity ward had completely run out of beds. Because of the emergency, Keiko would have to stay in Curie's room. Everyone accepted the decision. Everyone except Shuichi. The instant Keiko walked inside, Shuichi's face turned pale. He leaned close to Curie and warned her, "Don't let her stay here." Curie stared at him in disbelief. Why? Shuichi hesitated before answering. Get a strange feeling from her. His words sounded cruel, but deep down, he wasn't speaking about Keiko herself. He was sensing something growing inside her just then. Mosquito began flying around the room. Without thinking, Shuichi pulled out a can of insect spray and started chasing it. He sprayed wildly across the room. The mosquito finally dropped to the floor, but the chemical smell filled every corner of the hospital room. Keiko immediately started coughing violently. The nurses rushed in, shouting at Shuichi for spraying insecticide inside a hospital. Holding the dead mosquito between his fingers, Shuichi looked at Curie. Then he said something that made her pause. "Only female mosquitoes drink blood, and they do it for one reason: to feed the eggs growing inside them." Those words lingered in the air, like another warning from the spiral. The nurse quickly threw Shuichi out of the room to let fresh air inside. Keiko eventually stopped coughing and apologized for the trouble. She smiled weakly, but then she quietly admitted something that chilled Curie. She didn't hate mosquitoes anymore. In fact, she liked them a lot. Curie couldn't understand. How could someone who had nearly died from mosquito attacks suddenly love them? Keiko simply closed her eyes and drifted peacefully to sleep. That night, the familiar buzzing returned. Curie opened her eyes. A mosquito was somewhere nearby. She searched the room. Nothing. The sound wasn't inside. It was coming from the hallway. Curious, she slowly opened the hospital door. The corridor stretched into darkness. The buzzing grew louder and louder. Then shapes began appearing at the far end. A group of women silently walked toward her. Every one of them wore hospital gowns. Every one of them smiled without emotion. Their skin was covered with mosquito bites. Their empty eyes stared straight ahead. As they drew closer, Curie realized something horrifying. They had all come from the maternity ward, but what truly froze the blood in her veins was what each woman carried in her hands: heavy hand drills. Without speaking a single word, the women quietly split up and entered different patient rooms. The metallic squeak of the drills echoed through the silent hospital. Curie's heart pounded. She couldn't understand what they were doing. Then she peeked into one of the rooms, and what she saw made her entire body go numb. One of the pregnant women had climbed onto a sleeping patient's chest. She pressed the drill against the victim's body, as if she were about to perform a horrifying ritual. The moment Curie peeked into the room, her worst nightmare became reality. One of the women from the maternity ward drove the hand drill straight into a helpless patient's neck. Blood burst across the bed. The victim never even had a chance to scream. Slowly, the woman turned her head toward the doorway. Her pale, lifeless eyes locked onto Curie. A twisted grin spread across her face. Then, in a raspy whisper, she said, "You saw." The words echoed through the silent hospital. Curie froze. The woman climbed off the corpse, still gripping the blood-covered drill, and began moving toward her. Only then did Curie finally snap out of her fear. She turned and ran as fast as she could. But the horrifying woman chased after her, repeating the same chilling words over and over. "You saw." Curie stumbled into the hallway, desperately searching for help. The monster was getting closer. Its laughter echoed behind her. Just then, a hospital worker stepped out after hearing the noise. He looked confused. "What happened?" "It's the middle of the night." Curie screamed for help, but before he could understand anything, he looked past her. The hallway was now filled with dozens of smiling pregnant women. Each one carried a hand drill. Each one wore the same empty expression. The man's face turned white with terror. The women slowly surrounded him. He begged them to stay away, but they simply smiled. Then together they pointed at him. Their voices merged into one terrifying chant. "Give us blood." The man's eyes became unfocused, as if he had fallen into a trance. The eerie whispers completely overwhelmed his mind, and a second later, he collapsed to the floor. Elsewhere in the hospital, the same nightmare was happening everywhere. Doctors, nurses, patients, anyone unlucky enough to be awake became a target. The pregnant women silently pinned victims down, then they pressed the spinning drills into their bodies. Fresh blood poured out onto the hospital floor. The women gathered around the wounds, laughing with terrifying joy as they collected every drop. Hidden around a corner, Kiri watched in complete horror. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. After draining enough blood, the women finally stopped. One of them smiled and whispered, "That should be enough for tonight." Groups slowly began returning to their rooms, as if nothing had happened. But suddenly, the leader stopped walking. She slowly turned around. Her smile disappeared. Then she whispered, "Wait." She had remembered something. Someone had witnessed the murders. Someone had seen everything. She slowly raised one trembling finger and pointed directly at Kiri. "That girl!" The others turned their heads at the same time. Every pair of lifeless eyes locked onto Kiri. Then the leader laughed. "She saw what I did." Silence filled the hallway. Then came the horrifying decision. "Then we can't let her live." Kiri's heart nearly stopped. She immediately crawled away before jumping to her feet and running for her life. The women chased after her, laughing as they dragged their drills across the floor. Kiri slammed herself into a nearby hospital room and desperately tried to hold the door shut. The old wooden door shook violently as the women pounded against it from the other side. The leader pressed her face against the crack in the doorway. Her swollen eyes stared directly at Kiri. With a horrifying smile, she whispered, "I'll drill through your cheek and out your eye." Kiri screamed for Keiko to wake up, but there was no answer. The door continued to splinter. It looked like there was no escape then. The room suddenly became quiet. Kiri slowly looked up. Standing beside Keiko's bed was Keiko herself. She held a hand drill. Her expression was strangely calm. She looked directly at Kiri, then smiled, and softly whispered, "Give me your blood." Before Kiri could react, the door exploded open. The crazed women burst into the room, rushing toward her from every direction. There was nowhere left to run, but at that exact moment, Kiri spotted something lying on the floor, a can of bug spray. She instantly remembered Shuichi's warning. Without hesitating, she grabbed the spray, aimed it straight at the charging women, and pressed the nozzle. Kiri pulled the trigger on the bug spray. A thick cloud blasted straight into the faces of the monstrous pregnant women. Instantly, the entire hallway exploded with horrifying screams. The creatures staggered backward, clawing at their faces as if the spray were burning them alive. One after another, they abandoned the attack and fled down the corridor in complete panic. For the first time that night, Kiri had survived. Breathing heavily, she stared after them in disbelief. Then everything suddenly became quiet. Shuichi had been right all along. The bug spray was their weakness when morning finally arrived. It was as if the massacre had never happened. Every blood-soaked hospital gown had vanished. Every hand drill had disappeared. The corridors were spotless. No one could believe that an army of pregnant women had spent the entire night hunting people for blood. The horrifying truth was buried before anyone could discover it, and Kiri couldn't help thinking. Someone had carefully cleaned up every piece of evidence. Perhaps the husbands had quietly disposed of everything to protect their wives, but the nightmare wasn't over. The women had collected blood for a reason. Their unborn babies needed it. Within only a few more days, children nourished by human blood would finally be born, and no one knew what kind of monsters those babies would become. The nightmare wasn't over yet. Only a few days had passed, and every pregnant woman at Kurazu Hospital was reaching the end of her pregnancy. One after another, labor began. The first to go into the delivery room was Kiri's cousin, Keiko. Standing outside the room, Kiri's heart pounded as agonizing screams echoed through the hallway. She couldn't bring herself to look, because she already knew the horrifying truth. Keiko's baby had grown by feeding on human blood. No matter what anyone said, Kiri knew those women had murdered innocent patients to keep their unborn children alive. And yet, not a single person believed her. Desperate, Kiri rushed to the hospital director and the head of the maternity ward. She told them everything. The murders, the blood, the attacks during the night. They'll kill again if we don't stop them. But instead of listening, the doctors exchanged worried looks. To them, Kiri was simply a traumatized girl suffering from terrible nightmares. The more she tried to explain, the more everyone treated her like she had lost her mind. Even her own family turned against her. How could you accuse Keiko of something so horrible? At that moment, Kiri realized she was completely alone. Because of the growing police investigation, the killings suddenly stopped. At least, that's what everyone believed. But Kiri soon discovered the horrifying truth. The women hadn't changed. They had simply become more careful. One day, she heard strange noises coming from a bathroom. Slowly, she looked inside. And there, she caught Keiko secretly drinking fresh human blood from a blood bag. Keiko slowly turned toward her, her face covered in dark stains. A twisted smile spread across her lips. You saw. Kiri's blood ran cold. Soon afterward, Keiko went into labor. The entire delivery room echoed with terrifying screams as doctors struggled to deliver the baby. Outside, Kiri stood frozen, unable to move. Every cry sent another chill down her spine. Finally, the crying stopped. The baby had been born. Unable to resist her curiosity, Kiri quietly walked toward the nursery. She expected to see a horrifying monster, a creature born from human blood. But when she looked inside, she froze. Lying peacefully in the crib was the most beautiful, the sweetest baby she had ever seen. And that only made everything even more terrifying. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters don't look like monsters at all. At first, everything seemed normal. The bobbies were born one after another, filling the nursery with tiny cries and innocent smiles. Doctors admired them. Nurses couldn't stop calling them adorable. Visitors crowded around, completely enchanted. Every newborn looked perfectly healthy. Almost too perfect. As Kiri stared through the nursery window, a strange feeling settled deep inside her chest. She had expected monsters. Instead, she saw the sweetest bobbies imaginable. That was what terrified her the most. A few days later, Kiri was finally told she had recovered enough to leave the hospital. As she walked through the maternity ward one last time, laughter echoed from every room. The new mothers were smiling. Their husbands proudly held their newborn children. Even Dr. Kawamoto couldn't hide his excitement. In all my years, I've never seen bobbies this wonderful. Everyone believed the nightmare was over. Everyone. Except Kiri. Then Keiko noticed her. Kiri. She gently lifted her baby and smiled warmly. I've already picked his name. This is Makio. Say hello to your cousin. Kiri hesitated for a moment. But as she looked into the baby's face, he simply smiled. A tiny innocent smile. He's so cute. For just one brief second, Kiri almost believed everything would be all right. But then, something caught her eye. Keiko. Is something wrong with Makio? His stomach. It looked swollen. The room suddenly became silent. One by one, Kiri looked at the other bobbies. Every single one of them had the same unnaturally swollen belly. It wasn't just Makio. All of them looked exactly the same. Dr. Kawamoto quickly laughed it off. They're only wearing belly bands. It's perfectly normal. Everyone nodded, satisfied with the explanation. But Kiri wasn't convinced. Something about those bobbies felt terribly wrong. Suddenly, one baby began to cry. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire maternity ward exploded with deafening screams. The cries weren't normal. They pierced straight through Kiri's ears like needles. She clutched her head in agony. The sound became so unbearable that she completely lost her balance. Before anyone could react, she tumbled down the hospital stairs. Everything went black. When Kiri finally woke up, she found herself back in another hospital bed. Fortunately, nothing had been broken. But the doctors insisted she would have to stay for another week. Everyone believed the fall had caused her pain. But Kiri knew better. My ears. They're still ringing. It wasn't my leg that hurt. It was those bobbies. Their cries were still echoing inside her head. Even in complete silence, she could still hear them. As the days passed, the hospital began serving a strange new ingredient with every meal. Mushrooms. Everyone praised them. They're delicious. They're good for your health. They taste just like meat. Patients couldn't get enough of them. Some even begged for more. But Kiri noticed something disturbing. The mushrooms really did taste like meat. And for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to eat even a single bite. Because deep inside, she had the terrifying feeling that those mushrooms weren't ordinary food at all. And what she would discover next was far more horrifying than anyone could imagine. Just when Kiri thought the mystery couldn't get any stranger, the whispers returned. Soft. Almost impossible to hear. She slowly followed the voices until she reached the nursery once again. At first she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The voices weren't coming from adults. They were coming from the bobbies. One tiny infant whispered, "The water in there was like heaven." Another answered, "I want to go back, it's cold here." A third baby smiled as it stared at the ceiling. "The womb is wonderful. Can we really go back?" Then another voice calmly replied, "Of course, Dr. Kawamoto will put us back." Kiri froze. These newborns weren't crying anymore. They were having a conversation. And every single one of them shared the same terrifying wish: to return to their mother's wombs. One baby's swollen stomach suddenly twitched. "Pup." Its belly slowly rose higher and higher. The infant giggled happily. Makio is being returned first. The moment Kiri looked closer, her blood ran cold. Something was pushing out from the baby's stomach. It looked exactly like one of those strange mushrooms. Only now she realized the horrifying truth. They had never been mushrooms at all. Before she could even process what she had seen, a horrifying scream echoed from the delivery room. Kiri instantly recognized the voice. Keiko. Ignoring the pain in her injured leg, she rushed toward the room. Her heart pounded wildly as she forced the door open. Instead of doctors, instead of nurses, she found an entire room consumed by living fungal creatures. Hundreds. No. Thousands of them. They covered the walls. They covered the floor. Their twisted stems crawled through every corner of the hospital like a living forest. Kiri stood frozen. What is this? Then someone stepped out from the darkness. Dr. Kawamoto. His face remained completely calm, as if nothing about this nightmare was unusual. Kiri desperately asked where Keiko and baby Makio were. The doctor looked at her with empty eyes before quietly speaking. All baby mammals are cute. They use that cuteness as a weapon. They cry because they need attention. They depend completely on adults. But these children, they don't want to grow up. They don't want independence. They want to remain unborn forever. The doctor's explanation became even more horrifying. He revealed that after birth, the umbilical cord should disappear forever. But these bobbies were different. Their umbilical cords began growing back. Even the placenta regenerated. They longed for the safety of the womb so desperately. Their own bodies were trying to recreate it. And those strange mushrooms weren't mushrooms at all. They were living placentas. Dr. Kawamoto pointed toward the endless field of fungal growth. After every delivery, the discarded placentas were thrown away. But they took root. They grew. Curiosity made him taste one. To his surprise, it restored his strength. Soon he realized they could heal the sick. So he secretly began feeding them to hospital patients. The same mysterious mushrooms everyone had been praising were actually living human placentas. The horrifying meals had been hiding in plain sight all along. Kiri's face turned pale. Where's Keiko? I heard her screaming. The doctor calmly pointed toward the delivery room. The procedure went well. It's all right. Procedure. What procedure? Without another second of hesitation, Kiri shoved past him and burst into the room. What she saw inside made her entire body freeze. Keiko lay on the bed, barely alive. Her stomach had been stitched shut with a massive surgical scar. Her skin had turned pale. Her lifeless eyes stared into nothing. It looked less like childbirth, and more like something had been put back inside her. And what happened next was even more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The moment Kiri stepped inside, Dr. Kawamoto spoke with chilling calm. The procedure was successful. The child has been returned to its womb. Those words made no sense. But when Kiri looked at Keiko, she wished she had never opened that door. Keiko's body was barely moving. Her eyes were completely white. Her skin had turned ghostly pale. Then in a weak trembling voice she whispered, Dr. Kawamoto. Blood. I need blood. Dr. Kawamoto stared at her without emotion. I don't know what will happen to the baby now. But I do know. She must nourish it once again. The horror wasn't over. It had only just begun. Unable to watch any longer, Kiri rushed toward her friend. Keiko. But before she could reach the bed, Dr. Kawamoto grabbed her from behind. What are you doing? He pulled her back with surprising strength. Kiri struggled desperately. Let me go. Keiko slowly raised her head. Her empty eyes locked onto Kiri. Then she stretched out one trembling hand. Here. Hurry. Give me. Suddenly, Keiko's mouth opened wider. And wider. Far wider than any human mouth ever could. From deep inside her throat, a massive spiral-shaped tongue burst outward. It twisted through the air like a living snake. Straight toward Kiri. The horrifying tongue whipped across the room in an instant. Kiri barely ducked. It sliced past her face before slamming into Dr. Kawamoto instead. Before he could even react, the tongue wrapped tightly around his neck. He screamed. But the sound didn't last long. Keiko yanked him backward. The doctor's body crashed onto the bed beside her. His terrified face twisted in panic. Then, she shoved the monstrous tongue straight into his open mouth. His screams were swallowed whole. The very monster he had created had chosen him as its first meal. Using the chaos as her chance, Kiri escaped from the delivery room. She stumbled through the endless forest of living placentas, gasping for breath. But the nightmare had already spread beyond that single room. Keiko came crawling after her. Her stomach was swollen. Her body bent unnaturally. Her endless tongue dragged across the floor as she shrieked. More. I need more. The noise attracted everyone nearby. Patients and visitors rushed into the hallway. But instead of running away, they calmly picked the strange mushrooms growing around them and began eating them. One bite, then another. The infection spread before Kiri's eyes. People's expressions became vacant. Their bodies no longer seemed human. The entire hospital was descending into madness. Kiri didn't wait to see what happened next. She sprinted through the corridors, burst out of Kurazu Hospital, and never looked back. Later, she admitted she had no idea what became of the hospital after that day. And she never intended to return to find out. But this nightmare was far from over. After everything Kiri had witnessed, the town finally seemed peaceful again. She and Shuichi quietly sat together on the beach listening to the waves crash against the shore for the first time in what felt like forever. Neither of them said a word. After a long silence, Kiri leaned gently against Shuichi's shoulder. A faint smile appeared on her face. You know, Shuichi, if it weren't for you, I would have died a long time ago. It was a rare moment of peace, but in Kuruzu town, peace never lasted. A strange sound suddenly echoed across the sea. At first, it was nothing more than a distant howl, then it grew louder and louder. The wind seemed to be calling from somewhere far beyond the horizon. Shuichi's face instantly turned pale. He knew exactly what that sound meant. He jumped to his feet and stared toward the ocean. It's the wind. A storm is coming, then he shouted with absolute certainty. Typhoon season, it's finally here. Without another word, Shuichi sprinted toward town, warning everyone he passed. Kiri could only watch in confusion. She had no idea why he looked so terrified. Before long, his warnings spread throughout the streets. A typhoon is coming. Board up your windows. Some people laughed at him, calling him a freak. Others ignored him completely. Meanwhile, television stations interrupted their regular programming, whether experts confirmed something unusual. An incredibly powerful typhoon was moving toward Kuruzu town. Its eye was much smaller than normal, making the storm even stranger than expected. No one realized this wasn't an ordinary typhoon. As the wind howled outside, Kiri sat at home with her younger brother. He asked an innocent question. What does the eye of a hurricane actually look like? Kiri smiled. Be silly. Hurricanes don't really have an eye, but outside. The wind continued screaming louder than ever. Meanwhile, their father hurried to secure the house. He nailed wooden boards across the windows before the storm arrived. His wife begged him to come inside. It's getting dangerous. The sky had already turned almost black. The entire town waited for the storm to strike the next day. Kiri insisted on delivering Shuichi's lunch. Her mother tried to stop her. Go outside, the hurricane's coming, but Kiri refused. She grabbed an umbrella and stepped into the raging wind. The storm was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The wind pushed against her from every direction. Her umbrella bent backward. Then, a massive gust exploded through the street. Her umbrella, schoolbag, and everything she carried were ripped away in an instant. Kiri nearly lost her balance. She looked up and froze high above the town. The clouds weren't swirling randomly. They formed one enormous spiral at the very center. A perfectly round hole stared back at her for a moment. Everything became eerily quiet. Kiri whispered to herself. Is that the eye of the storm? That night, the hurricane roared without stopping. The wind screamed around every corner of the house. As Kiri lay awake in bed, she heard something strange mixed within the howling. At first she thought she was imagining it, then she heard it again. The wind wasn't just making noise, it was calling, Kiri, Kiri, again and again. As if the storm itself knew her name. By morning, the skies were clear, birds were singing, the streets looked almost peaceful again. Kiri rubbed her eyes and looked outside. Guess the storm is finally over. But she couldn't shake one terrifying thought. Why did it sound like the wind was calling my name? And the answer was waiting just beyond the calm. The next morning, Kiri slowly opened her eyes. She let out a deep breath and tried to convince herself that everything from the previous night had just been a nightmare. Maybe I was only imagining it. Maybe the hurricane wasn't really calling my name. With that thought, she slid open the door. The storm seemed to be over, but the sky was still covered with strange, swirling clouds. Kiri stepped outside and looked up. Something immediately felt wrong. The wind was still blowing, not violently, just enough to make the air feel alive. Then she froze. High above her house, the enormous spiral was still there. The eye of the storm hadn't moved an inch. Her heart skipped a beat. But how? A hurricane was supposed to stay in one place, yet the giant eye remained directly above Kuruzu town, silently watching everything below. Inside the house, the television confirmed everyone's worst fears. Meteorologists had no explanation. For the second straight day, the hurricane had remained completely stationary over Kuruzu town. Experts called it an impossible weather phenomenon. Nobody understood why it refused to move at that moment. Kiri's younger brother nervously spoke up. Last night, I heard someone calling your name. It sounded like they were on the roof. Their parents stared at him in disbelief. Before anyone could answer, her mother suddenly realized something. Wait, where's Kiri? Meanwhile, Kiri was already outside. Despite the pouring rain, she continued walking toward Shuichi's house carrying his lunch. The streets were almost empty, only the endless wind accompanied her. Suddenly, someone shouted her name. Kiri. She turned around. It was Shuichi. He ran toward her through the rain, completely soaked. The moment he reached her, he exploded in frustration. What are you doing out here? I brought your lunch, you idiot, Kiri answered, but Shuichi wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the sky. He pointed straight above them. Can't you see it? That giant spiral, the eye of the storm, it's watching you. Kiri looked up again to her. It was only a hurricane, nothing more. She shook her head. That's ridiculous. Shuichi grabbed her shoulders. Didn't you hear the wind calling your name last night? Kiri's expression changed. What? The voice of the storm was calling you. Then Shuichi said something that sent chills down her spine. As long as you're standing beneath that storm, you're in danger. I think it's become obsessed with you. Before Kiri could even respond, the wind suddenly changed. The giant eye overhead began spinning even faster. A deafening roar shook the entire town. The air itself screamed. Then, without warning, a huge tree snapped in half. It crashed directly toward them. Run! Shuichi grabbed Kiri's hand. The two sprinted through the streets as trees, poles, and debris were ripped apart behind them. Every second, the storm grew more violent. They barely escaped the falling tree. But another disaster was already waiting. The building beside them exploded apart. Wood, glass, roof tiles, and heavy beams flew through the air like deadly bullets. The storm wasn't just destroying the town anymore. It was attacking everything around Kiri. A massive beam slammed into the ground, trapping Kiri beneath the wreckage. Shuichi. She struggled desperately. Stuck, Shuichi rushed back without hesitation, ignoring the collapsing buildings around him. He pulled at the broken wood with everything he had. Then, the impossible happened. The moment Kiri was finally freed, the wind wrapped around her body. Her feet slowly lifted off the ground. She wasn't jumping. She wasn't falling. She was floating higher and higher, pulled directly toward the enormous eye of the storm. The hurricane had finally made its choice, and Kiri was being taken straight into its terrifying embrace. Before Shuichi could react, Kiri's body was pulled higher and higher toward the terrifying eye of the hurricane. But then, something unbelievable happened. The storm suddenly stopped pulling. Instead, it violently spat her back out, like it had realized it had made a mistake. Shuichi stared in confusion. Why? The horrifying truth hit him. It mistook her for you. Because you two look alike. The storm wasn't after Kiri at all. Its real target had always been Shuichi. A dark funnel suddenly shot down from the eye of the hurricane like a giant hand reaching from the sky. It slammed into the ground with a deafening crash, but what emerged wasn't a human anymore. It was the old woman who had been swept into the storm moments earlier, except now, her entire body had been twisted beyond recognition. One giant eye bulged from beneath her hood while her limbs were bent into impossible shapes. She looked less like a person and more like something the storm had created. Kiri screamed in horror. Without wasting another second, Shuichi grabbed her hand. Move, we've got to get out of here. As they ran, Shuichi looked back at the funnel. It realized its mistake. Now it's coming after me. The hurricane became even more violent. Roofs exploded apart, power lines snapped, trees bent until they shattered. Every gust of wind echoed through the streets with one terrifying message. Kiri, Kiri, again and again. The wind itself seemed alive. The two finally ducked beneath a concrete overpass. For the first time, the screaming wind became quieter. Shuichi leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Can't see us under here. It's going crazy trying to find me. Kiri looked devastated. That woman died instead of me. If this storm is my fault, Shuichi shook his head. No, you can't control what the storm wants. Kiri stared toward the raging hurricane outside. If it stays here, What will happen to the whole town? Shuichi let out a bitter laugh. Who knows, maybe we should ask the storm itself. But before either of them could say another word, Shuichi's face suddenly changed. He looked toward the entrance. Get back, it's trying to peek inside. Outside, the wind slowly swept across the road, searching, looking almost like a giant eye scanning every hiding place. The overpass had protected them. But only for a moment. Then something shiny rolled across the pavement, a broken satellite dish. Its polished surface reflected Shuichi's face. The instant the reflection appeared, the spiral inside the storm locked onto it. Shuichi's eyes widened. No, it found us. Using the mirror, the hurricane exploded forward. A blast of wind ripped through the underpass, throwing broken wood, metal poles, and concrete in every direction. Down, Shuichi threw himself over Kiri as debris rained around them. Then he noticed something else. A manhole cover had been blown open. Below it, a storm drain. That's it, into the drain. The two hurried down the ladder as the roaring wind chased them from above, even underground. The sound of the storm echoed through the tunnel. Shuichi shouted. Faster, water splashed beneath their feet as they climbed deeper. But what waited below was somehow even more disturbing. The tunnel floor wasn't flat anymore. It was covered with countless swirling spiral whirlpools, as if the curse had already spread beneath the town itself before they could process what they were seeing. The roar behind them grew louder. The storm had forced its way into the underground. A massive twisting column of wind rushed straight into the tunnel, and it was coming directly for them. The underground tunnel became a nightmare. The spiral storm squeezed itself through the narrow passage like a living serpent, roaring louder with every second. The violent current ripped Shuichi away from the ladder, sending him tumbling helplessly through the twisting wind. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though he would be dragged straight into the gigantic eye of the storm. Kiri reached out desperately, but there was nothing she could do except watch him disappear into the spiraling darkness. The hurricane wasn't satisfied with simply chasing them anymore. Now it had invaded the underground itself. Its massive body twisted through the drainage tunnels, swallowing everything in its path. The walls groaned, the air howled. Every tunnel became part of the storm. Then, without warning, the enormous vortex changed direction. Instead of climbing higher into the sky, it curved toward Dragonfly Pond. Like smoke rising from a crematorium chimney, the gigantic spiral was slowly drawn into the lake. The water churned violently for hours, throwing waves onto the shore and ripping mud and clay from the lakebed as if the entire pond had become one giant whirlpool. Some time later, rescue teams finally found the survivors and pulled them out near Dragonfly Pond. Kiri, wake up! People rushed to help the exhausted teenagers. Shuichi was there too, barely conscious after surviving the storm's impossible pursuit. Against all odds, they were alive. News reports soon spread across the country after hovering over Kuruzucho for 2 terrifying days. Hurricane number 1 had suddenly disappeared. Meteorologists had no explanation to the outside world. It was simply another mysterious weather event, but Shuichi and Kiri knew the horrifying truth. The storm hadn't vanished on its own. The spiral curse had claimed it. Even more disturbing, the weather report continued, another summer typhoon was already moving north from the South China Sea. As the distant wind echoed across the ocean, Shuichi couldn't shake one terrifying thought. What if the spiral wasn't finished? If the next storm was already on its way to Kuruzucho? Several days passed after the horrifying hurricane, but Kuruzucho no longer looked like a normal town. The center of the city had been completely destroyed, and every house surrounding Dragonfly Pond had been reduced to piles of shattered wood. Even Kiri's home wasn't spared. By some miracle, her entire family survived, but now they had nowhere left to live. The hurricane itself had mysteriously vanished, sucked into Dragonfly Pond as though the lake possessed an invisible force that had claimed it. Still, the destruction it left behind was impossible to ignore. A town official eventually arrived with what he called good news. Because so many frightened residents had abandoned Kuruzucho, there were now plenty of vacant homes available for disaster victims. At first, Kiri's family felt relieved. Maybe things were finally starting to get better. But that hope lasted only a few minutes. The official stopped in front of a long, ancient row house. Its roof sagged under its own weight. The wooden walls were cracked. The entire place looked like it could collapse at any moment. Kiri's mother stared in disbelief. This is where we're supposed to live. She refused immediately. This place is a dump. But the official calmly explained that these abandoned row houses had always existed in Kuruzucho. Most had stood empty for decades. Only a handful were still occupied. And after the disaster, there simply wasn't anywhere else. Then the official casually mentioned something even stranger, according to local rumors. This particular building was haunted. People claimed a monster came out at night. Several neighborhood dogs had even been found torn apart and eaten. He laughed the story off as an old superstition, but somehow, nobody else was laughing. With no other options, Kiri's family accepted their fate. They moved into the decaying apartment. The official assured them that electricity had been restored and basic repairs had been completed. But once they stepped inside, reality hit them immediately. The walls were still cracked, the floors creaked with every step, water didn't even work. It felt less like a home, and more like an abandoned ruin barely pretending to be livable. Kiri's little brother couldn't hide his fear. I don't want to live here. This place gives me the creeps. Even their father admitted the building looked unbelievably old. It might have been built before the 19th century. Still, he reminded everyone they should be grateful to have a roof over their heads for now. Survival came first. Later that day, the family decided to greet their new neighbors. A friendly woman introduced herself as Wakabayashi. She welcomed them politely before quietly giving them an unexpected warning. People next door, they're squatters. They moved in long before the hurricane without anyone's permission. Atmosphere instantly became uncomfortable. Nevertheless, Kiri's mother walked over and knocked on their neighbor's door. Silence, no answer. Not a single sound came from inside that evening. The strange rumors returned. Kiri's little brother whispered nervously, "I think the monster lives next door." His mother immediately scolded him for saying something so ridiculous, but his frightened eyes never left the neighboring wall. As everyone tried to settle into their first night, Kiri noticed her father rubbing the sole of his foot. He frowned. There seems to be some kind of wart. She leaned closer to take a look. It was tiny, round, and strangely patterned, almost like a perfect spiral. Before anyone could think more about it, a long, eerie sound drifted through the ancient building. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the floorboards, it sounded like someone or something slowly breathing through the walls. And at that exact moment, unseen eyes opened inside the cracks, silently watching the new family from the darkness. That night, nobody in the old row house could sleep. A long, haunting howl echoed through the walls. You. The sound was so loud it seemed to vibrate through the entire building. Kiri slowly opened her eyes while her little brother sat upright in terror. "It's the monster, it has to be." Their mother tried to stay calm, listening carefully. It didn't sound like the wind, it didn't even sound human. It was more like the painful cry of some wounded animal. Then the boy pointed toward the wall separating their apartment from the mysterious neighbors. "Listen. It's coming from the other side." The family spent the rest of the night frozen in fear, wondering what kind of creature could possibly make a sound like that. The next morning, Kiri stepped outside to help clean the house. While scrubbing the old wooden porch, she met Mr. Wakabayashi. Curious about the terrifying noises from the previous night, she finally asked him about the family living next door. To her surprise, he wasn't frightened at all. According to him, the strange cries belonged to an old woman and her son. The son suffered from a severe illness that caused him constant pain. Nobody in town had ever seen him. The old woman refused to let anyone enter their home. People whispered that his disease had deformed his body so badly that the rumors of a monster simply spread on their own. Suddenly, an old woman carrying a basket slowly walked out of the neighboring house. Her back was bent. Her face was completely hidden beneath a cloth. Mr. Wakabayashi quietly whispered, "That's her." The elderly woman began hanging laundry outside, but as she struggled with the heavy blanket, her frail body started trembling. Before anyone could react, she lost her balance. The basket slipped from her hands, and she collapsed onto the ground. Kiri rushed over without hesitation. "Are you all right?" She gently helped the old woman sit up for just a split second. As the old woman's sleeve shifted, Kiri froze. Her hand wasn't normal. The skin looked horribly twisted, covered with strange spiral-shaped growths and swollen flesh. The sight was so disturbing that Kiri instinctively looked away. The old woman quickly hid her arm beneath her sleeve and silently returned inside, pretending nothing had happened. Mr. Wakabayashi asked what was wrong, but Kiri forced a smile. It was nothing, even though she knew it definitely wasn't. That afternoon, another scream shattered the silence, but this time, it wasn't the same eerie howl. It was the old woman. Her desperate cries echoed through every apartment. Immediately realized something terrible had happened. Without waiting for anyone else, she sprinted toward the neighboring house. Inside, the old woman sat on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her twisted hand reached into the darkness as she cried, my son, my son." Then, with tears streaming down her face, she whispered the words that made Kiri's blood run cold. "My son has died." Afterward, an ambulance arrived. Even experienced paramedics struggled for a long time before finally removing the body from the house. The old woman herself was rushed to the hospital after doctors discovered she was suffering from the exact same mysterious skin disease. The illness remained completely unidentified, and whatever had killed her son now seemed to be consuming her as well. Most people avoided the house after that, but not Mr. Wakabayashi. Instead, his curiosity only grew stronger. Almost excited, he confessed something shocking to Kiri. The previous night, he had secretly sneaked into the dead boy's room. The entire wooden floor was covered with hundreds of tiny holes, perfectly round, perfectly unnatural. When Kiri asked why, he simply smiled. "Have no idea." Then he leaned closer. But he wasn't normal, was he? His fascination with the tragedy made Kiri deeply uncomfortable. She quietly walked away, refusing to encourage his morbid curiosity. As another strange howl echoed somewhere across Kyuruzu-cho, a radio broadcast interrupted the silence. A second hurricane had already reached Japan, and for the first time, meteorologists reported that the storm's enormous eye could actually be seen from the ground. Meanwhile, Kiri looked down at her feet. The tiny wart her father had discovered the day before had multiplied. More spiral-shaped growths were appearing. Her little brother suddenly cried out in pain. "They hurt, they're all over my hands." Their mother looked down in horror. She had them too without realizing it. The same mysterious marks were beginning to spread through Kiri's family, and this time, the spiral wasn't just haunting the town anymore, it had entered their own bodies. Back inside the house, the situation took a horrifying turn. The strange wart-like bumps were no longer limited to Kiri's feet. Her little brother cried in pain. Their mother stared at her own hands in disbelief. Even Kiri's father was covered with them. Mysterious growths had spread across his entire body, but before anyone could understand what was happening, The front door suddenly slammed open. The powerful hurricane roared outside, shaking the entire house. Hi! The wind screamed through every crack in the walls then. Something even worse happened. Mr. Wakabayashi quietly pressed his eye against one of the tiny holes in the wall, only moments ago. It had been nothing more than a small crack, but now, it had transformed into a perfectly round opening, and I actually stared through it, grinning to himself. Wakabayashi whispered, "Kiri, you're so beautiful, I've been watching you ever since you moved here." His obsession had driven him insane. The tiny hole wasn't enough anymore. He wanted a better view. Just make another one. But as he looked down, his smile disappeared. The spiral growths had begun covering his own hand. Curse had finally reached him too outside. The hurricane only became stronger inside. Everyone screamed as unbearable pain shot through their bodies. The so-called warts weren't staying the same. They were growing, stretching, hardening. Sharp spiral horns erupted from Kiri's feet. Her mother screamed in horror. These aren't warts. The family finally realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't some ordinary disease. It was the exact same nightmare that had consumed the old woman and her son. The storm trapped them inside. Roads were blocked, hospitals were unreachable, every gust of wind sounded like a monster roaring outside. Fear completely took over the room. Are we going to die too? No one had an answer. Their father could barely move. Their mother desperately called out to their neighbor. "Mr. Wakabayashi, can you hear us?" But no reply came. Day after day. The hurricane refused to leave, and with every passing hour, the spiral disease continued spreading through their bodies. Kiri looked around the room, then suddenly everything clicked. She realized this wasn't an infection. It wasn't spreading from person to person. It was the house itself. "Mom, I think it's because of this house. If they stayed there, whatever lived inside those walls would eventually consume all of them." Kiri made her decision. "We have to leave, even if the storm kills us." But before anyone could move, her little brother suddenly pointed toward the wall. Look, the wall was changing. Dozens and hundreds of enormous spiral horns burst through the plaster. Crack after crack raced across the room. The entire wall began breathing, twisting, growing, expanding like a living creature. With an earth-shaking crash, the wall exploded inward. Clouds of dust filled the room, and from inside the broken wall, something slowly revealed itself. Not roots, not horns, not a plant. A face. Mr. Wakabayashi's face. His entire body had fused with the house itself. Countless spiral horns covered his flesh. His mouth stretched open into an impossible grin filled with jagged teeth. He no longer looked human. He had become a living monument to the spiral curse. Just then, a terrified mouse ran across the rubble. The creature instantly grabbed it without hesitation. It stuffed the squealing animal into its enormous mouth. Crunch. Blood dripped from between its twisted teeth as it swallowed the mouse whole. The family stood frozen. Nobody could even scream then. The monster let out a deafening roar. "You!" It lunged straight toward them. The massive body crashed across the floor as countless spiral limbs reached for Kiri and her family. The nightmare they thought was trapped inside the walls had finally come alive, and escaping the house had just become almost impossible. The monster's horrifying voice echoed through the collapsing house. Kiri. It wasn't just attacking anymore, it was calling her name. Its countless spiral horns scraped against the walls as it dragged its enormous body closer and closer. Kiri froze. Her mother screamed at the top of her lungs. "Kiri, run, get out of here." That desperate cry finally snapped her back to reality. She crawled toward the doorway as the creature lunged after her. The monster burst forward with terrifying speed. Its massive mouth opened wide enough to swallow a person whole. Dozens of twisted arms reached toward Kiri. She was only seconds away from being caught. Then suddenly, a long wooden beam, ripped loose by the raging hurricane, blasted straight through the room. Heavy timber slammed directly into the monster's face. The impact threw its entire body backward. For the first time, the spiral creature actually stopped moving. It had been knocked away by the storm itself. That tiny opening was all Kiri needed. She crawled out of the collapsing row house as fast as she could. Behind her, the monster groaned while the hurricane continued tearing the building apart. Moments later, the unbelievable happened. Hurricane number 2 changed direction. Instead of destroying the town, its massive spiral of wind was pulled straight into Dragonfly Pond. As the storm disappeared, the strange horn-like growths covering everyone's bodies slowly vanished as well. Whatever curse had been gripping them seemed to lose its power. At least for now they had survived, but only by a miracle. The house that had trapped them had nearly become their grave, and the spiral had claimed yet another victim. The nightmare was over, or so everyone hoped, but in this town, nothing ever stays over for long. Days after surviving the nightmare, the outside world finally decided to investigate what had happened inside Kyoruzu-cho. A television news crew drove toward the isolated town, hoping to uncover the truth. According to the reports, Kyoruzu-cho was just a small town of 6,000 people, nestled between the mountains and the sea. But after hurricanes 1 and 2 struck, every hurricane that followed had completely cut the town off from the outside world. No one knew what was happening inside anymore. And the reporters were about to find out. As their van sped through the long tunnel leading into town, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The cameraman glanced behind them. Then his face turned pale. A twisting column of wind was racing straight toward the van. "It's a twister." The driver slammed the accelerator, but it was already too late. The tornado caught the vehicle in seconds. The van spun wildly through the air like a toy before crashing onto the road and rolling over again and again. When everything finally became silent, the crew crawled out of the wreckage, bruised but alive. The reporter immediately reached for her phone to call for help. No signal, not even a single bar. They were completely cut off from the outside world. With no other choice, she began walking toward the town alone. As she moved through the deserted road, something felt horribly wrong. The air was strangely heavy even though it wasn't cold. She could actually see her own breath. Overturned cars littered the roadside. There wasn't a single living person anywhere. Not a voice, not a sound, only silence. When she finally reached Kuruzucho, her heart nearly stopped. The entire town had vanished. Homes, shops, streets. Everything had been reduced to mountains of broken wood and twisted rubble. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles. Buildings had completely disappeared beneath endless debris. She stared at the destruction in disbelief. The hurricanes really do all this, then? She heard the distant chopping sound of helicopter blades. Looking up, she spotted a television helicopter circling above the town. Relief washed over her face. Finally, someone else had survived, but before she could celebrate, a massive spiral of wind suddenly rose from the ruins. The tornado swallowed the helicopter whole. Within seconds, the aircraft disappeared inside the spinning vortex before crashing somewhere far away into the water. The reporter stood frozen. Even rescue wasn't safe anymore. Determined to find survivors, she climbed deeper into the endless sea of collapsed buildings. But every step only revealed something more horrifying. Bodies everywhere. The ruins weren't just filled with broken houses. They had become a graveyard. She covered her mouth in horror. Is anyone still alive? Just then, a deep mechanical rumble echoed across the destroyed town. She followed the sound until she reached the edge of a lake. What she saw there made her forget everything else. The entire lake had transformed into one gigantic spiral. The water wasn't flowing anymore. It was spinning endlessly, like an enormous whirlpool waiting to pull the entire town into its center. And at that moment she realized, the spiral curse hadn't ended, it was only getting started. As the reporter stared at the endless whirlpool, another horrifying sight caught her attention. Scattered across the ruins, several children were tied tightly to broken wooden posts. Their mouths were covered and they couldn't even cry for help. For a moment she couldn't believe what she was seeing. My God. Without wasting another second, she rushed toward them and quickly untied the ropes. It's okay, I'll set you free. One by one, the frightened children were released. She gently asked them who had done this, and where all the adults had gone, but the children didn't answer. Instead, they silently turned around and began walking away. Confused, she followed them. The children led her through the destroyed streets until they stopped in front of one house. Oddly enough, it was still standing. While every other building had collapsed into splinters, this single house remained almost untouched. Then something impossible happened. The children suddenly smiled, not with relief, but with excitement. At the exact same moment, a gigantic whirlwind burst out from the house itself. The entire building twisted violently before exploding into thousands of shattered pieces. The children burst into laughter. As if they were watching a game, the reporter stood frozen. Why were they enjoying this? Then one of the boys looked directly at her. That's the woman from before. Another child grinned. Let's get rid of her. Before she could react, they all started running after her, but they weren't chasing her normally. As they ran, small whirlwinds began spinning behind them. The faster they moved, the larger the spirals became. Within seconds, several deadly tornadoes were racing across the ruins, hunting her down. She threw herself to the ground just before one tornado ripped past her, shredding everything in its path. The children calmly continued walking. If we go slowly, we'll make a twister behind us. Reporter could hardly breathe. What is wrong with these kids? Cornered and exhausted, she watched in horror as the children surrounded her. We thought she'd be too hurt after the last one. Let's finish her off. They took another step forward. The spirals behind them grew even larger. The reporter screamed for them to stay away. Then suddenly, the impossible happened. A far more powerful tornado roared across the town and swallowed all three children before they could move. Their screams vanished instantly into the spinning vortex. The reporter stared in complete shock. She had no idea what had just saved her. A familiar voice suddenly called out from behind the wreckage. Are you all right? She turned around, and standing there was Kiri Gashima along with her younger brother Mitsuo. The reporter immediately recognized Kiri from television interviews. Kiri quickly helped her up while explaining that they were searching the ruins for food. Still shaken, the reporter asked the question that had been haunting her ever since entering the town. What is happening here? Kiri looked toward the gigantic whirlpool in the distance. Town is gone. The whirlwinds, the ruins, the deaths. Then she revealed the terrifying truth. The lake had become an endless whirlpool. Every hurricane that struck Kuruzucho had eventually been swallowed into Dragonfly Pond. Now, that whirlpool never stopped spinning, and because of the enormous pressure created by it, even the slightest movement, or the smallest loud noise, could instantly create a deadly whirlwind anywhere in the town. The spiral curse had evolved once again. Now, even walking too fast could become a death sentence. The reporter could barely process everything she had just witnessed. With tears in her eyes, she looked at Kiri. So, anyone can create those whirlwinds? Kiri nodded. Yes, anyone. Have to move slowly. Even speaking too loudly can create one. Even your breath is enough. Those words hit the reporter like a nightmare. That meant the children she had blown away, the helicopter crew, maybe every death she had witnessed. She could have caused them herself. Overwhelmed with guilt, she nearly broke down, but Kiri gently stopped her. Don't cry. It's too dangerous out here. We'll take you somewhere safe. They carefully made their way across the ruined town. Kiri explained what was happening. People often talk about the butterfly effect. The idea that something as tiny as the flap of a butterfly's wings can eventually create a hurricane somewhere else. But in Kuruzucho, that theory had become reality. The smallest movement, the faintest breath, even a whisper, could unleash a deadly tornado. Every single person had become a walking disaster. Eventually, they arrived at what looked like an old abandoned shack. Surprisingly, unlike the rest of the town, the building had survived almost untouched. Kiri explained that many old, worn-down houses had somehow escaped destruction. It was almost as if the spiral curse ignored buildings that were already falling apart. "This is where we live now." She quietly invited the reporter inside. The moment the door opened, the reporter froze. The tiny shack was packed with dozens of frightened survivors, families, children, old people. Everyone sat silently together. There wasn't even enough room to stand. The reporter introduced herself. "Chai Marayama, from Toyo Television. My crew was injured outside town. Please, can someone come help them?" Silence. Not a single person moved. Finally, an elderly man sighed. "It's useless. If we wanted to help, you won't be able to leave this town." Reporter stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean? No one can leave?" Another survivor answered. "Everyone who came here after the last hurricane. Reporters, rescue workers, volunteers, they're all trapped here now. Even cell phone signals can't escape Kuruzucho anymore." Room grew even colder. It wasn't just the town that had become isolated. Reality itself seemed to be closing in around them before anyone could say another word. A loud voice came from outside. The reporter looked toward the entrance. Standing in the ruins were the same children, bruised, covered in dirt, but still alive. One of them stared directly at her. "You killed him." Reporter's heart stopped. She immediately apologized. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." But the children didn't care. Their cheeks suddenly swelled as they took a deep breath. Everyone inside instantly understood what was coming. Inside, the survivors slammed the door shut just as an enormous blast of air exploded from the children's mouths. The entire shack shook violently, yet somehow, it didn't collapse. Outside, the children frowned. "This stupid house won't break." Something about the building was resisting the spiral's power, so they picked up heavy wooden boards and broken doors. "If blowing won't work, we'll smash it down." With cruel smiles on their faces, they charged toward the shack. And what they planned to do next would make the nightmare even worse. The children couldn't believe it. Even after unleashing one devastating whirlwind after another, the old shack still refused to collapse. Confused, one of them muttered, "That didn't do anything." Inside, panic spread through the survivors. "We can't just sit here. We have to fight back." Desperate, everyone took a deep breath at the same time. 1, 2, 3. Then dozens of terrified people exhaled together. A massive gust of wind burst through the building, slamming into the children's tornado. For a brief moment, it actually worked. The violent current threw the two boys backward, sending them flying across the ruins. The survivors erupted into cheers. "We did it. They deserved that." For the first time, it looked like the people had found a way to resist the curse. But Shuichi wasn't celebrating. He sat quietly against the wall, staring into space. Kiri called his name. He slowly looked up, his face pale with fear. "This town, it's going mad." Mad spiral. It's trying to become one giant spiral. Every strange event, every disaster, every victim, none of it was random anymore. The entire town was slowly transforming into a living spiral. Outside, the silence lasted only a few seconds. Then, laughter echoed across the ruins. The children weren't injured at all. Instead, they were smiling. One of them spread his arms and suddenly allowed himself to be carried by the spinning wind like a leaf caught in a hurricane. His body floated effortlessly through the air. The second boy followed. Soon both children were riding inside the tornado itself, spinning around it with horrifying joy. Flying, they're moving like butterflies. Everyone inside watched in complete disbelief. The children had somehow learned to control the whirlwind instead of being consumed by it. The spiral wasn't hurting them anymore, it was teaching them. At that moment, everyone realized the terrifying truth. Kuruzucho wasn't simply cursed anymore. The town itself was evolving. And every day, the spiral was creating something even more terrifying than the day before. The wind never stopped, even after destroying almost the entire town. The sky continued to howl as countless whirlwinds rose from the endless sea of rubble. One, then another, and another. It was as if the earth itself had begun breathing spirals. But something even more terrifying was happening inside those tornadoes. The gang members who had mastered the spiral weren't hiding anymore. They were treating the tornadoes like playgrounds. Laughing wildly, they surfed through the raging winds as if gravity no longer applied to them. The spiral carried them effortlessly through the air. Soon, dozens of them gathered together. Their leader pointed toward the damaged elementary school. "Dead ahead. Prepare to attack." Without hesitation, the entire gang charged through the tornado, using the spinning wind like a highway in the sky. Seconds later, the giant whirlwind slammed into the already shattered concrete building with a deafening crash. Walls exploded into dust. Chunks of concrete, steel, and glass were ripped apart and swallowed by the spiral. The school never stood a chance. Watching from a safe distance, Kiri could only stare in horror. More people have joined them. They're destroying every concrete building they can find. Gang had grown stronger, and the spiral had given them a terrifying new weapon. Nearby, little Mitsuo watched the flying gang with sparkling eyes. "It looks fun. Maybe I'll join them." Kiri immediately grabbed him. "Even think about it. People have died trying to ride those." The little boy only frowned. Hungry, food had become almost impossible to find. Looking across the ruined town, Kiri sighed. "I don't understand how they still have the energy to keep doing this." Someone answered with an even darker truth. "They steal food from relief shipments and rescue teams. Even though supplies kept arriving, no one outside the town realized the horrifying reality. Once people entered Kuruzu-cho, they never came back out. Mitsuo clenched his fists. They get whatever they want while we're starving. We're sneaking around just to avoid making whirlwinds. Before anyone could calm him down, a sharp scream suddenly echoed across the ruins. Everyone froze. A violent blast of wind rushed between the broken buildings. They turned toward the scream, only to discover something impossible hidden beneath the collapsed debris. Several enormous spiral shells were lying together. At first, they looked like ordinary giant snails. Then, one of the shells moved. The massive creature slowly pushed itself forward. Its body crawled out from beneath the shell, and everyone gasped. It wasn't a snail. It had a human face, a twisted, swollen face covered in slimy skin. Its eyes stared blankly ahead. Its mouth trembled, and thick slime dripped from its body as it slowly crawled across the ground. Snail people. I swear I saw them move. Kiri stood frozen in disbelief. Then Shuichi quietly revealed the horrifying truth. They used to be human. Strange things happening in this town have turned some people into snails. Group stared at the monstrous creatures in complete silence. If the spiral could transform ordinary people into monsters, then no one in Kuruzu-cho was safe anymore, and what they discover about these snail people next is even more horrifying. The horrifying discovery of the snail people left everyone speechless. But there wasn't even time to process it. The group desperately searched for a safe place and eventually found one of the old wooden row houses. Unlike the modern concrete buildings, these traditional homes had somehow survived the endless whirlwinds. As soon as they slid the door open, they realized why. The inside was already overflowing with survivors, families, children, elderly people. Every inch of the house was packed. People were practically sitting on top of one another. The air was suffocating. Arguments broke out over the smallest things. Stop pushing. Not pushing. Close the door. There's a draft. No one wanted another person inside, but there was nowhere else to go. One survivor shouted, "Get out. There's no room." Another replied, "We were living here before you people came." The entire building felt like it could explode at any moment. Someone quietly explained the terrible situation. These old wooden row houses are the only buildings the whirlwinds can't destroy. So everyone is gathering here. If this keeps going, we'll be packed together like sardines. And something strange caught everyone's attention. An old man digging into the cracked wall suddenly shouted, "Look what I found, hidden inside the plaster." Someone had sealed away an ancient scroll. Carefully they unrolled it. It wasn't an ordinary scroll. It was a map of Kuruzu-cho, but something about it felt deeply wrong. Instead of normal streets, the town itself had been drawn as one enormous spiral. Every road, every neighborhood, everything curved toward the center. Kiri stared at it in disbelief. So this town has always been connected to the spiral. Shuichi's father examined the map silently. His face grew darker with every second. Around them, however, the shelter was falling apart. People had become exhausted, hungry, paranoid. A starving survivor screamed at a Red Cross volunteer. "Hungry? Don't you have any more food? We ran out yesterday." That answer only made things worse. People began shouting, accusing each other, fighting over nothing. One man snapped at Shuichi, "You keep mumbling to yourself. You're driving me crazy." Shuichi quietly whispered the same words again. "This town is going mad." Angry man completely lost control. He grabbed Shuichi, dragged him outside, and threw him into the rubble. The shelter door slammed shut behind him. "Now we've got more space." For a moment, no one said a word. Watching people abandon each other so easily was even scarier than the storm outside. Standing among the ruins, Kiri finally said what everyone had been thinking. "We can't stay here anymore. Have to leave this town." A rescue worker revealed one final nightmare. "I tried escaping through the tunnel. I wanted to tell the outside world what happened here. The tunnel never ended. No matter how far she walked, the exit never appeared. The spiral simply refused to let anyone escape." Hearing that, Shuichi lowered his head. "It's exactly as I said. The spiral won't let us leave." Shuichi's father suddenly spoke. "Not leaving." Everyone looked at him in shock. "I want to stay. I want to rebuild my kiln. Create the ultimate work, the art of the spiral." His obsession had completely consumed him. Even after everything that had happened, he cared only about making pottery. When his wife reminded him that the special clay from Dragonfly Pond was gone because it had become another giant whirlpool, he simply stared into the distance. Then a delicious smell drifted through the ruined town. Mitsuo sniffed the air. "It smells good. It's roasting meat. There must be food nearby." Before anyone could stop him, a hungry boy began running toward the scent. The others chased after him, hidden between the piles of wreckage. A small fire burned beneath another twisting whirlwind. Several whirlwind riders stood around it. Their faces were hidden behind dark goggles. The atmosphere felt wrong, dangerously silent. Kiri shouted, "Mitsuo, stay away. Those are the whirlwind riders." But hunger had already clouded the boy's mind. He walked right up to them with an innocent smile. "Excuse me, we have some too." The riders slowly turned their heads toward him. Not a single one answered. The only sound was the crackling fire, and the terrifying silence that followed made everyone's blood run cold, because what was roasting over that fire was something no one could have imagined. The group froze in horror as the strange riders gathered around the giant shells. Then one of the shells cracked open, another one split apart, and another. The riders calmly nodded to each other. "Think they're done." Without the slightest hesitation, one of them slammed his cleaver straight into the shell. The thick spiral shell broke apart, revealing a massive roasted snail inside. But this wasn't an ordinary snail. Its face, still looked horrifyingly human. It wore a twisted smile frozen in death. The writers didn't seem disturbed at all. Instead, they happily carved slices from the creature like it was a perfectly cooked meal. "Let's eat, that's perfect." One after another they stuffed the meat into their mouths. "They're delicious." Then one of them turned toward Mitsuo. "You can have a bite, kid." Kiri's entire body trembled. "Eating the snail people?" The writer laughed. "This stuff is tasty. Just think of it as escargot." Kiri immediately shook her head. "But that's not escargot, they're human." Man's grin stretched even wider. "We're human, not now. Don't you girls stay with us. You can eat like this every night." Shuichi stepped forward without hesitation. "We're not joining your gang." The writers burst into laughter. "Gang? We're more like dragonflies. Dragonflies eat meat." They pointed toward the sky where children had once floated away. "Remember those little kids who learned to fly first? I wonder what happened to them." Laughter echoed through the ruined town. Then they whispered almost cheerfully, "We'll teach you how to fly too." Before anyone could react, Shuichi's father suddenly stepped in front of everyone. "Leave us alone," the leader smirked. "Move it, old man, or you'll get hurt." "I told you to stay away." The old potter refused to move for just a second. Everything became silent then. A violent whirlwind exploded between them. The old man screamed as the tornado grabbed him and hurled him high into the sky. Kiri's desperate scream echoed across the ruins. How could you?" But the writer only smiled. "We don't have to fight. Could be friends." Shuichi couldn't take it anymore. He swung his fist with all his strength. The punch landed square across the writer's face. The man staggered backward for a brief moment. Everyone thought they had actually hurt him. Instead, the writers burst into laughter. The tornado around them suddenly grew stronger. Within seconds, every writer leaped into the spiraling wind. They soared through the air like birds. "Ha ha ha, they're airborne. Prepare for takeoff." The whirlwinds multiplied across the town. Massive tornadoes twisted together, turning the sky into a spinning maze. Kiri grabbed Chai's hand. "Let's get out of here." But it was already too late. The wind caught them one after another. People were ripped off the ground. Their bodies spun helplessly inside the giant vortex. "Take my hand." Chai reached desperately toward Kiri. Their fingers finally locked together below them. The whirlwind riders flew effortlessly through the storm. "Prey is escaping at 12 o'clock. Form up and pursue." "Roger." The riders treated the hunt like a game, laughing, chasing, enjoying every second of it. Kiri looked down through the storm, and her heart nearly stopped. Dragonfly Pond, the gigantic spiral whirlpool, was directly beneath them. "We're getting closer. We're being blown into the whirlpool." The pull became overwhelming. The spiral dragged everyone toward its center. Just when it seemed impossible to hold on, Shuichi reached out with every ounce of strength he had. "Grab it." Kiri stretched her free hand toward him, her fingertips barely brushing his, but the wind only grew stronger, and with the deadly whirlpool waiting below, it looked like all three of them were about to disappear into the spiral forever. What happened next would become one of the most terrifying moments in the entire story. The dragonfly riders spotted their prey trying to escape. One of them suddenly shouted, "Who's that?" Another laughed as they banked through the tornado. Do a 180. In an instant, the entire squad turned around inside the raging wind and dived straight toward Kiri and the others. Their laughter echoed through the storm as they descended like predators hunting helpless prey. But before they could reach them, the giant whirlwind beneath suddenly changed. Instead of pulling people around it, the tornado folded into itself. Then with a deafening roar, it plunged straight into the enormous spiral whirlpool below. The riders screamed in complete shock. The force was so powerful that even they couldn't control it anymore. One after another, they were dragged into the center of the vortex. Meanwhile, Kiri slowly opened her eyes. She realized something unbelievable. Shuichi had managed to grab onto a utility pole at the very last second. One by one, everyone else clung to the pole as the storm raged around them. Barely able to breathe, Kiri looked at Shuichi. "Shuichi?" He stared silently at the terrifying spiral below. Only one word escaped his lips. "Mad." The gigantic whirlpool continued spinning faster and faster. Its thunderous roar shook the entire town. No one knew what was about to happen next, and that terrifying silence made everything even worse. The storm finally began to calm, but the nightmare was far from over. As news of the disaster spread, more and more people entered Kuruzucho from the outside, hoping to rescue their families or deliver supplies. Instead, they walked straight into hell. The entire town had been reduced to mountains of broken wood and twisted metal. Everywhere they looked, massive whirlwinds were spinning across the ruins. People cautiously made their way through the wreckage, warning each other to move slowly. Then someone suddenly screamed, "It's coming, get down." Another tornado tore through the debris, throwing shattered buildings into the air like they weighed nothing. Everyone hit the ground, desperately trying to avoid being swept away. When the wind finally passed, a young volunteer checked on Shuichi's group. "Are you all right?" After making sure everyone was safe, he introduced himself. He explained that he had walked here from Midoriyama 5 days earlier after hearing about the disaster. He had come as a volunteer to help survivors, but after entering the town, escaping became impossible. Another survivor nodded in agreement. He had arrived 4 days ago searching for his relatives. Now he was just another trapped victim. The man revealed something even stranger. No matter which direction they walked, they always ended up back in the exact same place. He had tried countless times to leave by simply walking in a straight line. Nothing worked. Even someone who had an excellent sense of direction admitted it felt as though space itself had been twisted inside out. Hearing that, Kiri remembered her own terrifying experience inside the tunnel. She quietly explained that while walking through it, the passage had suddenly begun twisting into a giant spiral. The darkness had pulled at her as if it wanted to swallow her whole. She only escaped by crawling backward with everything she had. Until now, she thought she had imagined it. But after hearing everyone else's stories, she realized the impossible was happening to everyone. The volunteers hadn't given up though. Some people had tried escaping across the sea by building makeshift rafts. At first, it looked like their plan might actually work. Everyone watched as the raft drifted farther and farther away. Then, the surface of the ocean began to rotate. A small current quickly grew into a gigantic whirlpool. Before anyone could react, the raft was dragged toward the center. The survivors screamed in horror as the sea swallowed every last person aboard. With that, their final escape route disappeared. The sea itself had become another giant spiral. The volunteer sighed. That weighs out. He explained that many survivors were already losing their sanity after days trapped inside the cursed town. Others were barely hanging on. When Kiri asked where everyone was staying, the volunteer revealed that most shelters were already overcrowded. The only places that still seemed safe were the old row houses scattered around town. Shuichi's group decided to head there immediately. Along the way, they entered one of the collapsed homes. Inside, they found an injured woman lying beneath the broken roof while her frightened son sat beside her. She couldn't move after being struck by one of the whirlwinds. Between tears, the boy whispered that his father had disappeared. He believed the tornado had simply lifted him into the sky and swallowed him forever. The scene left everyone speechless. As they continued walking, the volunteer pointed out another mystery. Every modern concrete building had collapsed into rubble, yet the old wooden row houses, the oldest and weakest-looking buildings in town, were somehow still standing. No one could explain why. Hope returned for the first time in days. Maybe some of those forgot houses still had room for survivors. As they walked, the volunteer finally smiled and introduced himself. "My name's Tanizaki." The exhausted group exchanged their names one by one, realizing they had all become companions simply by wandering through the same nightmare. But before anyone could relax, one of the survivors suddenly groaned. "My back feels strange." Shuichi immediately knelt beside him. The moment he pulled back the man's shirt, everyone froze. A perfect spiral had appeared beneath his skin. It wasn't a wound, it wasn't a bruise, it was growing from his own body. Shuichi stared at it with horror before speaking the words no one wanted to hear. "He's already begun to change. Become a snail person soon." Kiri's face turned pale. "Why is this happening to so many people?" Shuichi looked at the spiral in silence, then he gave the only explanation he could think of. "Maybe, because they're moving so slowly now, the spiral has finally caught up to them." And with those chilling words, everyone realized they might be next. The horrifying discovery spread through the group in seconds. One survivor nervously lifted his shirt. Nothing. Everyone sighed in relief. But then another man checked his back. A perfect spiral. Then another and another. Panic exploded. The survivors realized it wasn't just one victim anymore. The curse was spreading and no one knew who would be next. The terrified man grabbed Shuichi by the shoulders. "So, I'm going to turn into a snail too." "Tell me that's not true." Before Shuichi could answer, someone shouted, "Quiet, you'll cause another whirlwind." The entire group immediately lowered their voices. By now they had learned the cruel rule of the town. Loud noises attracted the spirals. Shuichi forced himself to stay calm. "We don't know what's causing people to become snails. All we can do is avoid what we already know is dangerous." That meant moving carefully, speaking softly, and finding one of the mysterious row houses before nightfall. But Tagawa couldn't control his fear. "Tanizaki, do you think this spiral will disappear once I'm inside a row house?" Tanizaki lowered his eyes. "I don't know." Those three words completely shattered Tagawa's remaining hope. I don't want to become a snail." His trembling voice echoed through the ruined town. Not long afterward, the group finally spotted one of the old row houses still standing. For a brief moment, everyone believed they had been saved, but as they got closer, their hearts sank. The house was already packed with survivors. People crowded behind the wooden bars, staring at them with cold, lifeless eyes. The desperate newcomers begged, "Please, let us in. If we stay outside, we'll turn into those things." The answer came immediately. "No, it's full, go somewhere else." Even when Tagawa cried, "I'm turning into a snail," no one inside showed the slightest bit of sympathy. "What do I care if you become away?" Something inside Tagawa finally snapped. Ignoring everyone's warnings, he rushed toward the gate and grabbed it with both hands. "Open up! I'm coming in whether you like it or not." The other desperate survivors joined him. Together, they threw their weight against the old wooden entrance. "Pull, it's opening." Inside the house, the people screamed in terror. "Stop, get out of here." Just then, something strange caught Kiri's attention. Several children inside the house were staring silently through the cracks in the gate. They weren't crying, they weren't afraid, they simply watched. As if they already knew what was about to happen, the gate finally gave way. At that exact moment, a deafening whirlwind descended from the sky. The tornado slammed into the house with unimaginable force. The survivors outside could only watch in horror. Then, something impossible happened. The people trapped inside suddenly opened their mouths and blasted enormous gusts of wind from their throats. They weren't screaming anymore, they were creating the whirlwind itself. The air pressure smashed into the attackers, throwing them backward while the tornado ripped apart the collapsing building. Wood, roof tiles, and debris exploded in every direction. The survivors outside froze. What the hell? The walls collapsed. The horrifying truth was finally revealed. Inside the house, Hundreds of people had become fused together into one gigantic living mass. Arms, legs, faces, and bodies had twisted together into an endless knot of human flesh. Every face stared blankly with empty white eyes. Every mouth hung open in silent agony. One survivor quietly explained the nightmare. No matter how hard we tried to keep people out, they kept sneaking in. This is the result. Their bodies were pressed together until they became tied into knots. Before anyone could even process what they were seeing, the unstable row house finally gave up. With a thunderous crash, the entire building collapsed, and the massive knot of fused human bodies burst out from the wreckage like a living avalanche. Everyone could only stand frozen as the impossible nightmare crawled into the open. The giant knot of fused bodies didn't stop after escaping the collapsing house. Instead, it began doing something even more disturbing. The countless arms stretched into the wreckage, grabbing broken planks, shattered beams, and scraps of wood. Piece by piece, the living mass started covering itself with debris. It wasn't random. The creature was rebuilding its shelter. Shuichi stared in disbelief, covering their exposed bodies with scrap wood, and they're adding it onto the house. Survivors watched silently as the monstrous pile slowly buried itself beneath layers of timber, almost as if it were trying to recreate the row house it had just destroyed. Shuichi suddenly understood. The row houses weren't protecting people. The people inside were becoming part of them. One frightened survivor asked, "Did this happen in every row house?" No one had an answer. After a long silence, Shuichi proposed an idea. "What if we find another row house and expand it? If we build sideways, maybe there'll be enough room for everyone." Suggestion shocked the group. "You can't be serious. Should be thinking about escaping, not living here forever." Shuichi lowered his head. "I know. Besides, even if we did that, eventually become one of those monsters." Before anyone could continue, a violent whirlwind suddenly roared across the ruins. "Get down!" Everyone threw themselves onto the ground as another tornado ripped through the destroyed town, carrying broken wood high into the air. When the storm finally passed, a desperate voice shouted from the distance, "I see ships." Everyone immediately looked toward the coastline. There, floating just offshore, was an entire rescue fleet. Coast Guard vessels, military ships, dozens of rescue boats. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope returned. "A whole task force came to save us. We're getting out of here." They certainly took their time. Even Shuichi allowed himself to smile, but Kiri remained strangely quiet. Shuichi noticed her expression. "Come on, have to tell your mother." Kiri slowly shook her head. "I know. I still have to find my dad." Before anyone could argue, their smiles disappeared far out at sea. The ocean itself began to move. At first, small circles appeared on the water, then the circles grew larger and larger, until the entire sea transformed into one enormous spiral. The rescue fleet had unknowingly sailed straight into its center. The ships began spinning helplessly, one after another. They were dragged toward a gigantic whirlpool. The survivors could only watch in horror. "No, it can't be." Every rescue ship vanished beneath the endless spiral. Their final hope disappeared with them. As darkness slowly covered the ruined town, the exhausted survivors searched through the rubble for anything edible. The supplies they found barely amounted to a few scraps. "It isn't enough to keep us alive." Then one man shouted excitedly, "I found some meat." Everyone rushed over, but the moment they saw it, their faces turned pale. The meat wasn't animal meat. Someone had cooked one of the giant snail people. "So, this is what you meant by meat." Nobody wanted to touch it, but hunger was stronger than disgust. One survivor finally picked up a piece. "We don't have much choice." Soon, others followed, one bite, then another. "It doesn't taste bad. It's not really human anymore." Can't afford to be picky. Even the people who had been horrified only moments earlier began eating. One man laughed bitterly. "If I'd known it tasted this good, I would have eaten one sooner." Shuichi looked at the meat in his hands, then at Kiri. She couldn't hide the fear in her eyes, but neither of them had the strength to refuse. Slowly, Shuichi raised the meat to his mouth. That night, for the first time, he ate the flesh of a snail person, and deep inside, he couldn't help but wonder, how much of his own humanity had he just sacrificed? The next morning, after surviving another horrifying night, Shuichi, Kiri, and the others gathered the last remaining pieces of cooked snail meat in a worn plastic bag and left Tanazaki's group behind. Their destination was simple. They wanted to return to the small shack where Kiri's mother and little Mitsuo had been hiding. Every step across the endless sea of broken lumber filled them with dread. The town looked even more lifeless than before, but they kept convincing themselves that the shack had somehow survived. Finally, they reached the place. Shuichi stopped. Kiri's face turned pale. The shack was gone. Nothing remained except a mountain of shattered wood. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Kiri suddenly heard a faint voice buried beneath the debris. "Kiri, I'm stuck." Mitsuo, without thinking twice, she rushed toward the collapsed wreckage. "I'm getting you out." As she frantically pulled away broken boards, Mitsuo cried weakly from underneath. It was a whirlwind. Then Kiri froze. "Where's Mom?" Mitsuo's trembling lips barely moved. She got blown away." Those few words shattered Kiri's heart. She couldn't even cry. She simply stared at her little brother in disbelief. But before anyone could process what had happened, something behind Mitsuo made Shuichi's blood run cold. There, crawling out from beneath the rubble, was a horrifying human-sized snail. Its shell had completely fused into its back, and its twisted body slowly dragged itself forward. At that exact moment, Shuichi realized there was no time to mourn. If they hesitated, they would all die. He knew only one thing: they had to escape. After witnessing the horrifying fate of Kiri's mother, Shuichi made a painful decision. There was no time left to grieve. If they stayed any longer, Mitsuo would eventually complete his transformation into another snail person. Shuichi looked at Kiri with determination. We're leaving. He promised her that once they escaped this cursed town, Mitsuo might return to normal, and only after finding a way out would they come back for their parents. But Kiri had one question: if we can't leave by the road, and the sea is impossible, then how are we supposed to escape? Shuichi lifted his eyes toward the mountains surrounding Kurazu-cho. What about the hills? It wasn't a perfect plan. The trail could be dangerous and nobody knew whether it actually led outside the town. But standing still meant certain death. They searched through the debris until Shuichi found an old stick and drew a rough map in the dirt. After comparing every possible route, they made their choice. Northern trail. It was steep. It was risky. But it was their only chance. Wrapping Mitsuo in a blanket, the small group quietly began climbing the mountain path, leaving behind the endless ruins of the town. As they walked higher, Mitsuo suddenly scratched at his back. Kiri, my back itches. She gently scratched it for him and smiled, trying to hide her fear. Hang on, we'll be out of here soon. Reaching a higher point, they looked back over Kurazu-cho. The view was unbelievable. Almost every building had vanished beneath mountains of broken wood. Only the long row houses still remained standing, surrounded by countless spinning whirlwinds. Then Mitsuo noticed something. All the row houses faced Dragonfly Pond. Everyone looked toward the center of town, the pond, the row houses. Everything suddenly lined up in a perfect spiral. Before they could even process what they were seeing, another violent whirlwind slammed into one of the row houses. Inside the storm stood a familiar face, Mr. Tanizaki. Completely obsessed, he hammered wooden planks onto the roof while screaming into the wind. Are you trying to escape? I'll finish this before you return. There'll be room for all of you. Shuichi stared in disbelief. Then he noticed something even stranger. Tanizaki wasn't working alone. Across the ruined town, countless survivors were expanding their row houses as if possessed by the same insane idea. At that very moment, an eerie emergency siren echoed through the air. The electricity had died long ago. Yet the siren continued to scream at uneven intervals, piercing everyone's ears like a warning from the town itself. Ignoring the terrifying sound, Shuichi pushed everyone deeper into the mountains. But the forest wasn't normal anymore. The grass had twisted into spiral shapes, the trees bent and curled unnaturally, even the vines wrapped themselves into endless coils. It was as if nature itself had surrendered to the curse. They kept walking and walking, but the trail never seemed to end. This path is much longer than I remember. Mitsuo grew weaker with every step. My back hurts. We're going too fast. Then footsteps echoed ahead. Another group of survivors appeared on the narrow trail. It was Mr. Takemoto and the others. Kiri immediately asked, "Weren't you trying to leave town too?" Takemoto nodded. "We took the mountain trail after seeing you." Shuichi frowned. "Which trail?" "The one beside Kurazu High School." A heavy silence followed. Then Takemoto looked at them with confusion. "We followed you, and somehow, we came right back here without realizing it." Blood drained from everyone's faces. The mountain wasn't leading them out of Kurazu-cho. Somehow, the spiral had folded the path back into the town itself, and in that moment they realized the most terrifying truth yet. There was no exit anymore. The horrifying truth finally sank in. No matter which trail they chose, every single path twisted back into Kurazu-cho. Panic spread through the survivors. "None of these paths work. We'll never get out." Some were already ready to give up, but Shuichi refused to surrender. "We have to keep moving." Standing still inside this cursed forest would only make things worse, so the two groups decided to continue together, pushing deeper into the endless maze of spiral-shaped trees. As they walked, Kiri noticed something strange. One of the men was leading another person with a rope tied around his neck. Confused, is he on a leash? The answer made her blood run cold. "That's Akamoto. Can't be allowed to run away." Then the man smiled with terrifying calmness. "He's the most important member of our group." Everyone looked at him in confusion, until he continued. "He's our emergency food supply. When he finishes turning into a snail, we'll eat him." Silence filled the forest. The man's smile only grew wider as he grabbed Akamoto's shirt and revealed the enormous shell growing from his back. "Look at that shell. It's full of meat." Kiri felt sick. Even the adults had started abandoning their humanity. The curse wasn't only changing their bodies anymore. It was changing their minds. Still, everyone continued walking. The deeper they entered the forest, the more unbearable it became. Every tree twisted into impossible spirals. Every vine curled like giant snakes. Even the grass formed perfect coils beneath their feet. Looking at the scenery for too long made Kiri's head spin. "I can't look at this. It makes me dizzy." Just then, Akamoto suddenly froze. His body trembled violently. Then, with a sickening sound, two long eye stalks slowly pushed out of his face. His transformation was complete. Before anyone could react, he dropped onto the ground and began crawling like a giant snail. One of the starving men burst into laughter. "Well, look at that." Moments later, hunger completely overwhelmed the group. "We're starving. He's really become a snail. So, should we cook him?" Another man grinned. "No, I'd like to try him raw." Kiri stared in horror. These people weren't joking anymore, they were serious. Akamoto sensed the danger and slowly tried hiding beneath his shell. One man pulled out a knife, another lifted a heavy rock, but someone stopped him. "If you smash the shell, you'll create a whirlwind." Instead, the starving man dropped onto all fours beside the shell. Smiling like a wild animal, he whispered, "I'll show you the best way to eat a snail." Then he shoved his entire head underneath the shell. and began eating. Crunch, munch, a horrifying chewing echoed through the forest. The others watched with hungry eyes. How is it? Is it good? The man never answered. He kept eating, faster and faster, until the shell itself started rolling across the ground while he remained trapped underneath it, devouring everything inside. The other survivors panicked. Stop, don't eat all of it. Come back, but it was already too late. Watching the madness unfold, Shuichi immediately grabbed Kiri, now, while they're distracted. Without looking back, the four of them quietly slipped away, leaving the cannibals behind. As they escaped deeper into the cursed forest, Shuichi looked around at the endless spiral-covered landscape. His face turned pale. Spiral. It's everywhere. It's inside us, and all around us. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, no landmarks, no sky, no sense of direction. Kiri whispered, I wonder where we are. Shuichi didn't answer then. His eyes landed on an old tree stump. For a brief second, hope returned. You can tell north by looking at a tree stump. But the moment he stared at its rings, his face froze. Every growth ring formed one perfect spiral. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed from inside the wood. Shuichi, come, join me. His heart nearly stopped inside the spiral pattern. He saw his father's face. Dad, it's my dad. Shuichi rushed toward the stump in complete shock, convinced the voice was real. Kiri grabbed him desperately. Shuichi, calm down, it's only you're deep inside. Everyone feared the same terrifying possibility. What if the spiral wasn't just changing the town anymore? What if it had already begun invading their minds? The deeper they traveled into the cursed forest, the stranger everything became. Kiri glanced at her watch, hoping it would tell her how long they'd been wandering. But the second hand wasn't moving normally anymore. Instead, it slowly curled into a spiral. It feels like time itself is leaving us behind. Every step felt heavier than the last. Even walking had become painfully slow, as if the forest was stretching every second into eternity. Meanwhile, little Mitsuo had grown too weak to continue. Hungry and exhausted, he had begun chewing on the strange spiral-shaped leaves covering the ground. Kiri quickly stopped him. Mitsuo, don't eat those, they're dangerous. The little boy barely responded. He was too tired to care. Just then, footsteps echoed through the forest, slow, heavy, closer and closer. The four of them froze. Out of the darkness emerged three familiar figures, the same starving survivors they had escaped earlier, only now they looked even worse. Their eyes were wide and lifeless, drool hung from their mouths, their faces had become almost animal-like. The spiral had completely consumed their sanity. One of them smiled. We meet again. Did you leave us? Kiri nervously forced a smile. We just got lost. Man ignored her answer. Instead, his eyes settled on Mitsuo sleeping peacefully on his sister's back. Awa, the kid's asleep. How sweet. Then his expression suddenly changed. Wait, is his back so swollen? Kiri's heart skipped a beat. She quickly answered, it's just a backpack. Men stared silently, then one stepped forward. You look tired. Me carry him. Fine, carry him, another man insisted. We're all going the same way. Atmosphere instantly turned suffocating. Everyone knew exactly what they wanted. Shuichi calmly stepped between them. Carry him. Without waiting for permission, he lifted Mitsuo onto his own back. For a moment, the three men backed off, but as they continued walking together, the hunger inside them only grew stronger. Getting hungry again? Any snails around here? The others laughed. Spoiled. They're hard to find in these hills. Then one of them looked directly at Mitsuo. Is there any food inside your brother's backpack? Kiri's face went pale before she could answer. Something unbelievable happened. Two long eye stalks slowly emerged from Mitsuo's face. The curse had finally reached him. Shuichi froze in horror. The starving men smiled. I knew it, so that's what you've been hiding. Suddenly, Mitsuo's body began slipping from Shuichi's shoulders. His skin had turned soft and slippery like a real snail. Hold still, Mitsuo. Shuichi desperately tried to keep him on his back. But Mitsuo's body continued sliding downward. The three starving men licked their lips. So, how should we eat this? Screamed. The four of them immediately fled through the spiral forest with Mitsuo still clinging to Shuichi's back, but Shuichi stayed calm. Run wildly, slowly and steadily. After what felt like forever, a forest suddenly ended. The group burst out onto a steep cliff overlooking the sea. Below them stood the lighthouse on the opposite side of town. How did we get here? We were on the other side of town. The impossible forest had twisted space itself, but they had no time to think. The starving men were already catching up. Shuichi looked at Mitsuo. Mitsuo has to escape before they get here. Then he noticed something incredible, now fully transformed into a snail. Mitsuo could cling to vertical rock walls. Shuichi knelt beside him. Can you crawl down this cliff? The little snail nodded. Kiri's eyes filled with tears. You can, then go, please. You have to escape. With one final look at his sister, Mitsuo slowly began crawling down the cliff. I promise. Come back for you. Everyone watched as the tiny snail disappeared lower and lower toward safety, but before anyone could relax, a voice echoed behind them. Hand over that snail. Starving survivors had arrived. Shuichi immediately stepped in front of the girls and whispered, act like we're still carrying Mitsuo. The desperate bluff was their only chance. But would these hungry monsters believe it? Or had they already realized their prey was gone? Shuichi didn't dare look back. He quietly whispered to the others, we have no choice. Let's keep moving. We'll find Mitsuo later. Behind them, the three starving survivors laughed like madmen. Are you really going to leave? One of them licked his lips and smiled. Remember what Akamoto tasted like? The others immediately began reminiscing about the horrifying meal. They weren't talking about survival anymore. They were talking about it with pleasure. Will we eat it raw? Of course we will. Their voices grew almost dreamy, sliding inside that shell, chewing on the soft flesh of his face. That magical space made me feel like my whole body was becoming a spiral. Memory alone was enough to drive them insane. Their bodies suddenly twisted violently, bones cracked, limbs bent into impossible shapes, their arms and necks curled into giant spirals as if the curse had completely taken control. They no longer looked human, they had become living spirals. Seeing the horrific transformation, Shuichi realized the terrifying truth. It's inside us. The spiral is living inside every one of us. Without wasting another second, the three friends hurried deeper into the forest while the twisted monsters writhed behind them. Even after putting some distance between themselves and the creatures, nobody relaxed, everyone was exhausted. We should already be close to town. But then, they stopped. Something ahead made every one of them freeze in place. Their expressions instantly changed from exhaustion to absolute disbelief. What horrifying sight was waiting just beyond the trees? The moment they reached the top of the hill, every single one of them froze. What should have been Kuruzucho was gone. Instead, an enormous spiral stretched across the landscape. The entire town had been twisted into one massive circular structure. Shuichi stared in disbelief. Where are we? Kiri could barely recognize anything. This isn't Kuruzucho. But as they looked closer, something impossible caught Shuichi's eye. One familiar rooftop, then another. His eyes widened. Wait, look over there. That building, I know it. Everyone followed his finger. It really was a house from Kuruzucho, only now it had become one tiny piece of the gigantic spiral. Horrifying realization struck them. The endless row houses had somehow connected together, curving around and around until they formed an entire city-sized spiral. Shuichi finally understood. Survivors built this. Kiri couldn't believe it, but they had only just started expanding those houses before we left. How could they build something this enormous in just a few days? Then another terrifying thought crossed her mind. Wait, how long were we actually gone? She tried to remember, but the memories felt blurry. Time itself had become unreliable. Shuichi looked back toward the impossible town. We might have been trapped much longer than we think. Time doesn't flow normally inside a spiral. Group carefully approached the gigantic structure. From nearby, Shuichi pointed at several sections of the wall. That's the original house. The newer rooms had simply been added onto both sides over and over again, until every building fused into one endless maze. None of it seemed planned, yet somehow, every single addition fit together perfectly, almost as if an invisible force had guided everyone's hands. Shuichi quietly muttered, maybe the spiral was shaping this town long before any of us were born. Maybe what we're looking at isn't something new. Maybe this is what Kuruzucho always wanted to become. The thought was enough to leave everyone speechless. Kiri finally broke the silence. Going inside. Have to find my parents. Shuichi immediately volunteered to go with her. We'll help you find them. Three stepped toward the endless wall of connected houses. Every entrance had been sealed shut, but after searching carefully, they finally discovered a narrow alley running between the buildings. It stretched forward like a tunnel with no visible end. They walked deeper. The strange architecture began affecting them. Shuichi rubbed his head. I can barely think straight. Everything feels dizzy. Kiri waved her hand through the air. Something was horribly wrong. Look, when I move my arm, it doesn't twist anymore. The first time since entering the cursed forest, the spiral's influence seemed weaker. Maybe these endless row houses were somehow shielding them, or maybe the danger inside was something even worse. Suddenly, the old wooden buildings groaned. Creak, the walls whispered. Soft voices echoed from behind the wooden slats. Murmurs, endless murmurs. Kiri slowly approached one of the windows. Excuse me, is anyone in there? I'm looking for my parents. My father's name is Yasuo Ogashima. He's a potter. There was no answer, only silence. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw them, dozens of human faces, crushed together behind the wooden bars, eyes starring without blinking, bodies fused into one another. Watching her from the darkness, and in that instant, Kiri realized the people inside hadn't survived the spiral. They had become part of it. Kiri's voice echoed through the narrow alley. I'm looking for my parents. For a long moment, nothing answered. Then one of the swollen faces hidden behind the wooden bars slowly opened its eyes. In a raspy whisper it replied, I don't know anything about your parents. Before Kiri could react, the creature made a strange request. Could you do us a favor, please? Get rid of what we're about to throw out. The wooden door suddenly slid open. Something heavy crashed onto the ground. At first it looked like a giant coiled snake, but then they realized the horrifying truth. It was a human corpse, twisted so tightly that its entire body had become a grotesque spiral. Its limbs had wrapped around themselves, bones crushed beyond recognition, while its face was frozen in an expression of endless agony. The creature behind the door calmly explained, he died this morning. It took us forever to untangle ourselves from his body. Please take it somewhere and burn it, before the smell becomes unbearable. None of them could answer. They simply backed away in horror. The deeper they walked into the endless alley, the worse the smell became. Rotting flesh filled the air. Every few steps, another spiral-shaped corpse lay abandoned in the middle of the path. Some had clearly been dead for days. Others were already melting into puddles beneath the summer heat. Shuichi looked around with growing dread. These people, they twisted into spirals, and then they died. Suddenly, a shuffling sound echoed from farther down the alley. Out of the darkness emerged a filthy, bearded man. His clothes were torn, his face was covered in dirt. Across his shoulders he carried another spiral corpse as casually as if it were a sack of garbage. Without emotion he muttered, "Well, here's another one." Kiri stared at him in disbelief. She recognized that face. Mr. Tanizaki, the exhausted man slowly turned toward her, his tired eyes widened. I remember you. Many years has it been. You haven't changed at all." Those words sent chills through everyone. Years had that much time really passed? Mr. Tanizaki explained that he had been assigned to clean the alleys. Construction was almost complete. The people inside the endless row houses were still building, adding room after room from within. Soon, there would be no empty spaces left. Desperate, Kiri interrupted him. "My father is a potter. Have you seen my parents?" Mr. Tanizaki paused for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "A potter? Yes, I heard about a couple still making ceramics near Dragonfly Pond." Kiri's eyes instantly lit up. "Really?" Mr. Tanizaki wasn't completely certain. He had never seen them himself, but he had heard people say, ceramics are the art of the spiral. Because of that, a potter and his wife might still be alive. Hope returned to the group for the first time in what felt like forever. They thanked Mr. Tanizaki and immediately continued deeper into the labyrinth. But the farther they traveled, the stranger the maze became. Collapsed buildings blocked every path. Towering mountains of rubble forced them to squeeze through tiny gaps between ruined houses. Every wrong turn ended in another dead end. From above, the endless spiral city looked like an impossible maze designed to trap anyone who entered. Finally, after crawling through another collapsed passage, the group froze. The walls around them weren't supported by wooden beams, they were supported by bodies. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of spiral-shaped corpses had been packed together inside the walls, holding the buildings upright like living pillars. Kiri felt her stomach turn. Shuichi silently stared at the horrifying construction far away. A deep roar echoed across the spiral city. The sound rolled through the endless maze like a gigantic wave. As they rested for a moment, Shuichi spoke quietly. "If my theory is correct, this entire city is recreating its original form." He looked toward the endless spiral stretching beyond the horizon. Whatever force is driving everyone to build these houses, it must be unimaginably powerful, and with every new corridor they crossed, the spiral was pulling them closer to the truth that had been buried beneath Kuruzucho for centuries. As the group rested for a moment, Shuichi finally put his terrifying theory into words. Maybe this wasn't the first time the spiral had consumed the town. Maybe it had happened again and again. For centuries, every few generations, the curse would awaken. It would force the people to rebuild the town into one enormous spiral, only for everyone to disappear once the cycle was complete. Kiri couldn't believe what she was hearing. Wouldn't there be records of something like this? Shuichi slowly shook his head. Maybe not. Everyone who could have told the story vanished, and every memory disappeared with them. The wooden houses surrounding them weren't ancient, which meant someone rebuilt them every cycle again and again, as if the town itself refused to die. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with them. None of them even knew which direction they were walking anymore. The endless maze had completely stolen their sense of direction. Just as despair began to settle in, Shuichi suddenly pointed toward the sky. "Look up." Everyone raised their heads above the rooftops. Dark smoke twisted into the heavens, but it wasn't rising in a straight line. It curled upward in one gigantic spiral. Kiri's eyes widened. "Smoke. It's coming from a cremation." Shuichi immediately understood. "It's drifting toward Dragonfly." Smoke itself had become a guide. Without wasting another second, the three of them ran after it. Every dead end slowed them down. Every collapsing building threatened to trap them forever. Then, Kiri spotted a narrow opening between two walls. "There's a gap." They rushed toward it. Wooden beams groaned violently. The entire passage began collapsing behind them. Shuichi squeezed through first. Kiri followed, but Chai was one step too slow. A massive wall of timber crashed down between them. "Chai!" Kiri screamed, grabbing desperately through the cracks on the other side. Chai's terrified face appeared between the wooden beams. Then, the walls began whispering, not from one place, but from every direction. "We're connected. We're connected here too. We're all connected." The voices echoed through the endless row houses as though the buildings themselves were alive. A deafening rumble rolled across the entire town. Something enormous moved through the wooden maze. It traveled beneath the houses, following a perfect spiral toward the town's center. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything fell silent. Shuichi placed his hand on one of the wooden doors. "Row houses have stopped expanding. If we go inside now, should finally reach Dragonfly Pond." Two slipped inside. Instead of ordinary homes, they found an endless wooden tunnel. Hallways stretched farther than the eye could see. Each passage curved slightly inward. The deeper they walked, the tighter the tunnel became. Finally, a bright light appeared ahead. They stepped outside and froze. Dragonfly Pond was gone. The water had completely disappeared. In its place stood an enormous spiral well descending deep beneath the earth. Ancient stone stairs wrapped endlessly around its walls. The same spiral-shaped smoke drifted straight into the darkness below. Kiri looked around in panic. "My parents, weren't they supposed to be making pottery here?" Shuichi quietly answered. "If they were here, they're gone now." He stared into the impossible abyss. All the row houses, all the winding streets, had secretly emptied into this hidden well. Someone had built these spiral stairs countless ages ago, but who and for what purpose? As the smoke disappeared into the darkness below, Shuichi whispered the thought that terrified him most. Source of the spiral curse. It might be waiting at the bottom of this well, and without knowing what was waiting below, they prepared to descend into the heart of the spiral itself. Standing at the edge of the ancient well, Kiri stared into the endless darkness below. There was nowhere else to search. If her parents were still alive, This was the only place they could possibly be. Taking a deep breath, she made up her mind. I'm going down there. A brief moment Shuichi remained silent, then he stepped beside her and gently reached for her hand. We'll both go? Kiri looked at him in surprise without another word. She tightened her grip. No matter what waited below, they would face it together. With one final glance at the world above, the two stepped onto the ancient spiral staircase, stone after stone. The stairs wound endlessly around the massive well. Each step carried them farther away from the surface, and deeper into the unknown. Air grew colder, the light above slowly faded, silence swallowed everything around them. There was no end in sight, only an endless spiral stretching downward. As though it had been carved into the earth long before history itself began, every turn of the staircase felt heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness below looked bottomless, yet neither of them stopped. Hand in hand, they continued descending toward the mysterious force hidden beneath Dragonfly Pond, whatever had cursed the town. Whatever had trapped generations of people inside this endless spiral, they were finally walking straight toward its source, but the deeper they descended, the more impossible the truth waiting below would become. The deeper Shuichi and Kiri descended, the stranger everything became. The spiral staircase stretched endlessly into the darkness as if it had no bottom at all. Every time they looked down, the stairs seemed to continue forever. Even time itself began to lose meaning. Neither of them knew how many hours had passed, or if it had even been hours at all. The silence was overwhelming. Shuichi kept warning Kiri not to stare into the endless spiral below. The hypnotic pattern was enough to make anyone lose their balance, but then, something appeared on the stairs. Lying motionless against the stone was the dried corpse of a man. His body looked centuries old, yet thick, pale vines twisted into perfect spirals had wrapped around every part of him. It looked less like a dead body, and more like it had been claimed by the curse itself. Kiri quietly realized the horrifying truth. The man must have wandered down here from the row houses, only to be left behind forever. Shuichi didn't even stop. They couldn't save someone who had already died long ago, but just as they tried to move past, a weak voice echoed through the darkness. Wait, take me with you. Kiri froze. The corpse had spoken. The shriveled figure slowly reached toward her with a trembling hand. There's supposed to be something wonderful down there. For a split second, Kiri's compassion almost got the better of her, but Shuichi immediately pulled her away. We can't. We don't have the strength to carry you. The old man suddenly grabbed her leg with terrifying strength. Take me with you. His voice changed from pleading to desperate. Then, without warning, his jaw stretched unnaturally wide. He clamped his rotten teeth into Kiri's leg. Blood sprayed across the stone stairs. Kiri screamed in agony as the corpse refused to let go. Shuichi rushed forward and desperately tried to tear the creature away, but the spiral vines suddenly came alive. They wrapped around Shuichi's body like giant snakes. In an instant, the monster dragged him backward toward the endless abyss. Kiri watched in horror as Shuichi disappeared deeper into the darkness. Shuichi, ignoring the pain in her injured leg, she ran after him without hesitation. Down the endless staircase. As she chased him, something unexpected appeared far below. A tiny light. It shimmered in the darkness like a distant star. For some reason, the light pulled at her mind. She couldn't stop looking at it. It felt warm, beautiful, almost inviting. Curiosity slowly overcame fear. She continued descending, unable to look away. Eventually, the staircase opened into something far beyond imagination. A gigantic underground cavern stretched farther than the eye could see. Towering spiral pillars rose from the ground like ancient monuments. The walls were covered with countless spiral patterns, making the entire cave feel alive. Kiri carefully climbed across the massive stone structures, desperately searching for Shuichi. But one wrong step was all it took. Her foot slipped. She barely caught the edge of the rock with both hands. Pebbles rained into the endless void beneath her. Her fingers slowly began to slide. She gritted her teeth, desperately trying to hold on, but her strength was fading, and just as her grip started to give way, something beneath her began to move. Kiri's fingers finally slipped. She screamed as her body plunged into the endless abyss below. For a brief moment, she was certain this was the end, but instead of crashing into the rocks, an invisible force slowed her fall. It felt as though a gigantic spiral wind was gently carrying her downward. She floated through the darkness before finally landing on something strangely soft. When she opened her eyes, her blood ran cold. The ground wasn't made of dirt or stone. It was an endless sea of human bodies. Millions of lifeless people lay fused together, their faces frozen in silent despair while spiral-shaped growths twisted through their flesh. Looking up only made the nightmare worse. Gigantic spiral towers rose toward the ceiling of the cavern. Massive cone-shaped structures, covered with endless spiral patterns, glowed with an eerie white light. The entire underground world looked like the ruins of an ancient civilization that no human should have ever discovered. The mysterious light pouring from those ruins was strangely beautiful, almost hypnotic. Kiri couldn't look away. Then a horrifying realization struck her. This wasn't just a ruin, it was an entire city, a city built entirely around spirals, and beneath her feet, the floor itself was made from the countless people who had disappeared from Kyorazucho throughout history. Every face was turned toward the glowing ruins, as if they had willingly gathered there. Shuichi. She desperately searched through the endless field of bodies. The farther she walked, the stranger the people became. Their skin had hardened like weathered stone. Their bodies were slowly transforming into part of the ancient ruins themselves. It was as though every victim eventually became another building block of this impossible city. Then, Kiri suddenly froze. Two familiar faces stared back at her, her mother, and her father, half buried among the countless bodies. They weakly opened their eyes. Dad. Tears streamed down Kiri's face. After everything she'd endured, she had finally found them. Her parents looked at her with fatting expressions and softly whispered her name. Kiri, so, you were here. Before she could reach them, another familiar voice echoed from nearby. Kiri. She spun around. Shuichi was alive. He had survived the fall as well, though he was badly injured and barely able to move. Relief washed over Kiri as she rushed toward him. Shuichi looked past her, toward the glowing spiral city. His face turned deadly serious. The spirals, they're alive. They have a will of their own. Realization hit both of them at once. This wasn't simply a curse. It wasn't an accident of nature. Something ancient had been waiting beneath Kurazucho all along, manipulating the town for countless generations, and whatever was hiding inside those glowing ruins was still alive. But as they stared deeper into the ancient city, an even greater truth was about to reveal itself. Shuichi stared silently at the glowing spiral city. His voice was weak, but his words carried a terrifying truth. I can feel it. It's seeping into me. He explained that the spirals didn't simply exist. They attracted everything toward their center, just like the human eye is naturally drawn to a spiral. The curse pulled people's minds, bodies, and even time itself toward its heart. No one knew who had built this impossible city. No one knew why it existed, perhaps. Its creators had vanished thousands, or even tens of thousands of years ago, but the city itself was still alive, still growing, still waiting beneath the earth for the next generation to feed it. Shuichi lowered his eyes. He no longer had the strength to move. Kiri, I'm done. I can't go on anymore. Leave me here. You have to keep fighting. I think this curse will soon be over. A long moment, Kiri simply looked at him. After everything they had survived together, there was no way she would abandon him now. She gently shook her head. I can't go on either. I'm staying with you. Shuichi slowly reached out his trembling hand. Kiri took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwined in that single moment. Nothing else mattered, not the curse, not the spirals, not death itself. They pulled each other close and embraced as they held one another. The spirals surrounding them suddenly came alive. Massive spiral roots coiled around their bodies. Instead of attacking, they wrapped around the couple like a cocoon. Then, the entire underground city began to shake. An endless roar echoed through the ancient ruins. Every gigantic spiral tower started rotating. The enormous shells turned together. Stone pillars twisted like living creatures. The city itself had begun to move. Everything spiraled inward, toward a single center, and then, time stopped, not slowed, stopped completely at the very center of the spiral. The endless flow of time became a single frozen instant, locked forever in eternity. Kiri remained in Shuichi's arms, unable to grow older, unable to die, unable to leave. The curse had finally reached its perfect form, and just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. But that wasn't the end of the story. The narrator reveals one final horrifying truth. One day, long after countless years have passed, a new town will eventually be built upon the ruins of the old Kurazucho. People will move there, families will settle there, children will be born there, completely unaware of what sleeps beneath their feet. Then, the eternal spiral will awaken once again. The curse was never destroyed, it was only waiting for the next cycle to begin. And that is the terrifying ending of Uzumaki, a story where evil can never truly be defeated, because some curses are destined to repeat forever.